A soft welcome drifts across a quiet room, like mist crossing a hollow before sunrise. A narrator's breath slows, and the space follows, dimming within itself. The invitation remains gentle, nearly weightless. A wandering thought opens, and a pale traveler from far beyond the sun steps into attention. The traveler bears a brief name from human catalogs and a longer history from the dark between stars. A question lowers its voice. What changes within a species when something unbound arrives, touches light, and leaves? A hush gathers. The traveler moves on a hyperbolic path, a curve that does not close, a geometry of leaving. The mathematics presents itself like a smooth stone turned in a slow hand, a trajectory with more energy than a family of planets can hold, a note that rises out of the instrument and stays in the air. The solar system listens without keeping. Gravity offers a bow and cannot detain the guest. The narrator's tone remains even, steady, as if reading the shape of the orbit the way an archaeologist reads a strand of river. What erodes? What deposits? What lets go? A small world brightens around the visitor, a coma unfurling like frost breathing out of itself. Dust hangs, then drifts, then thins. Light touches particles, and particles answer with a subdued glow, soft as pollen. The tail lengthens by degrees, a line the sun writes with heat, as though memory itself sublimates from grains. Every mote rehearses a story of temperature and time. The narrator lingers with that image, almost motionless. It feels like snowfall going backward, like a thaw in slow motion writing parentheses in the dark. Instruments wait with practiced patience. One old eye, patient as stone, gathers visible light in the hush above Earth. Another, younger eye, drinks the faintest near-infrared and mid-infrared size. Together, they do what craft allows. They turn distance into a thread of numbers and ask the thread to speak. Spectra emerge as hushed rainbows, not gaudy, not loud, just lines, dips, plateaus, marks that chemistry leaves when it pauses at the window. The narrator does not press for certainty. The lines might suggest water's simple curve, carbons, cooled breath, or some ratio that hints at a birthplace colder or warmer than expected. Each possibility arrives as an open palm, not a verdict. The visitor's speed remains untroubled by opinion. It enters and leaves according to the arithmetic of space, unrushed by human awe. Yet awe occurs. In a dark bedroom, in a quiet observatory, in a whisper-threaded studio, attention settles. The listener relaxes deeper into the surface beneath, as if body and orbit find a common ease. Somewhere, a telescope breathes through its cooling veins. Somewhere else, a data pipeline moves like a stream under ice. And somewhere else, a hand sketches a curve and writes a small Greek letter beside it. The narrator allows each image to appear, hover, and fade. In the open caboose of imagination, a question rides along. If dust carries a memory of formation, then what does this dust remember? Maybe the cold solitudes where hydrogen clings to carbon and writes simple verses. Maybe the crowded wattage of a nursery where newborn stars push and pull grains into new shapes. Perhaps the traveler's chemistry reveals a childhood beyond, the frost line of another star, where certain ices are abundant and others are rare. If so, the ratios become a map disguised as weather. No need for certainty. The suggestion itself offers rest, like a distant shoreline seen through evening haze. Earth continues its own ancient revolutions. Beneath oceans, clay turns over page. By page, slow as sleep. In the mantle, stone recycles stone with a patience older than bones. On the seafloor, microfossils count light with their shells, adding tiny ledgers to an archive that outlives empires. The narrator lets a different thought surface. A quiet reference to an old idea with a marine name. If an earlier industrial moment once rose and fell on Earth, disappearing into sediment and time, what traces might survive after geologic housekeeping? Has done its work? It remains only a question, whispered. A comet's passing does not answer it, but it reframes it. If interstellar dust holds a biography in isotopes, then planetary dust must hold one too, and both biographies dissolve differently, at different rates, under different suns. The mind rests in this parallel and does not demand resolution. The traveler's brightness changes day by day, as though breath deepens, then softens. The coma thickens near perihelion, thins afterward. Jets may begin as pinpricks and widen into veils, or they may not. What matters for the present is the way light and shadow practice their calligraphy on the visitor's surface, writing and erasing in a single gesture. The narrator holds the image of sunlight as a therapist of ancient ices, coaxes but does, not coerce, warms but does not burn, and in that warmth molecules decide to drift. Out of that drift come the clues. Light translated to numbers, numbers translated to curves, and curves translated to a careful wondering. Somewhere a graph sits on a screen, wavelength along one axis, intensity along the other. The pattern looks like a low line of hills where a river has once been. One trough may be water, another carbon dioxide, another carbon monoxide, or something subtler that requires a slower look. The narrator respects the time it takes to look slowly. Night sky work does not like hurry. Neither does sleep. Both ask for repetition, for attention that returns like tides. The mind relaxes into the patience of calibration. Dark frames, flats, cosmic ray removal. Small mercies that help an image admit what it has seen. The traveler keeps moving. Geometry demands it. A single pass through the sun's family, then the long return to the inward-outward of interstellar space. The hyperbola remains the quiet protagonist, a path of non-belonging that still touches, still crosses, still leaves a wake of influence. After the visitor's fading, what remains are tracks, published curves, small debates, revised models, new errands assigned to future instruments. The narrator lets these papers and preprints turn to autumn leaves in the mind. Beautiful, temporary, useful, then replaced by later growth. In the midst of this, a small, almost playful gesture occurs. A channel continues its slow practice of nightly companionship. A gentle invitation floats like a seed cloud. The listener may wish to return to these journeys, to keep company with the quiet movement of questions, to subscribe not to answers, but to the rhythm of looking. The request stays in third person, untethered to command, closer to weather than to marketing. It rises, drifts, and settles with the same kindness that light shows to dust. Silence grows. Stars hold their places. In this widening calm, the traveler takes on a story older than any specific instrument. For millennia, comets have carried omens, fears, calendars, crops. Now they carry data, and still they carry wonder. The narrator rests in the thought that both kinds of cargo remain human, and both remain partial. The mind settles at the edge of sleep where a second shoreline appears. The deep time coast where geology meets astronomy, where fossil oceans and fossil starlight are both read with tools and patience. On that coast, the visitor stands as a small cairn of meaning, a pile of stones at a trail fork that points in more than one direction. Breathing slows. The traveler's tale thins into the general dark. Somewhere distant, home starfields wait, impossible to name, yet likely ordinary in their own neighborhoods. The narrator allows a final image to open and rest. A grain of interstellar dust travels between suns for 1,000,000 years, unhurried, unafraid, bearing within it an arrangement that remembers a temperature, a pressure, a long-ago dance of atoms. In that grain lies a modest library written without script, legible only to patience. Tonight, patience holds the page. The hyperbola opens like a quiet gate through an old courtyard. It does not promise return. It moves with the calm assurance of a path that knows itself, crossing the neighborhood of planets as a guest already, leaving. In the grammar of orbits, the form means surplus energy, a gentle excess that gravity cannot hold. Eccentricity leans beyond one. The semi-major axis takes a negative sign, like a shoreline drawn by water that refuses to stay. The narrator lets these numbers soften into shapes a body can feel. An unclosing curve, a gesture of approach that becomes, without argument, a gesture of departure. Two thin directions lie in the sky where the curve keeps going, the asymptotes like shy rails that never meet. Along one, the traveler approaches from a darkness ordinary to itself. Along the other, it departs into the same ordinariness, which from here feels like mystery. Velocity at infinity waits on both sides like matching breaths, in and out, equal. In magnitude, opposite in aim. The solar system stands between them for a moment, a foyer with sunlit dust in the air and a floor of orbits worn smooth by repetition. The scene has no urgency. It is simply a geometry of welcome without possession. Those who love circles might feel a faint ache at this, but the hyperbola asks nothing of consolation. It teaches, by example, the art of passing through. The path bends near the sun, a slow hinge of light and heat, and then it straightens again. Some comets linger in long ellipses, returning after centuries. Others skim and go. This one goes. Relief lives inside the ache. A clarity that arrives when the desire for possession loosens its hold. The sky is not a cupboard to be stocked, it is a breathing room. Attention follows the curve with instruments that prefer patience to spectacle. Each observation fixes a point, right ascension, declination, brightness, and an uncertainty that shrinks with care. Fitting an orbit feels like threading small, glints onto a wire until a shape emerges. Inclination like the tilt of a head, argument of perihelion like a door left slightly ajar, the ascending node like the place where a stair meets a landing. In a barycentric frame, the background steadies, and the low hum of planetary tugs fades into a useful quiet. What remains is motion described without insistence, a guest's line through a familiar house. Gravitational assists, those quiet gifts planets offer to passing bodies, remain possibilities rather than events. The distances keep courtesy. The major masses nod as the guest slides by. If a tug happens, it happens as a nuance, a few degrees adjusted in silence. The narrator likes this refraining, this decision by the sky to avoid theater. The present becomes a resting place rather than a stage, a place where understanding gathers slowly in the shade. In the place of drama comes texture. Near the sun, sunlight warms trapped ices. Molecules drift free like letters brushed from an old slate. Dust lifts and the coma grows until it makes visible the path that mathematics already knew. A tale forms not as an announcement but as a slow exhalation. For observers, the tale is a grace note. For the object itself, it is the natural cost of coming close to fire. Grains leave, but form remains. The hyperbola holds. If geometry is a message, it is a message of context. The open curve says that this guest is not of this household, or at least not anymore. It belongs to a larger street, a district of stars and their surrounding night. Some such arrivals are ancient kin exiled by early violence at the dawn of systems. Others are citizens of entirely different suns, shaped in cousins of our nurseries. The curve cannot say which with confidence. It only says that the energy accounting favors departure and that the porch is open. The narrator walks slowly around this idea the way a person walks a stone circle at dusk, parallels surface. Rivers keep to their beds until a flood redraws the map. Then the water finds a new path and does not ask permission. Plate boundaries do their work whether or not anyone watches. In the same way, an orbit follows the rules of the field in which it moves. There is kindness in such lawfulness, a dependable hush that takes the edge off fear. When the sky is lawful, imagination can relax into wonder without needing to defend itself. Between inbound and outbound lies a neighborhood of turning. There, the sunward face sheds the most, and the nightward face remembers the cold it has carried. From far away, jets may flicker from slopes that catch light. They may not. The tiny nucleus, whatever its exact shape, holds together long enough to keep its appointment with elsewhere. Cohesion feels like a quiet miracle, stone and ice consenting to remain a single pronoun even as pieces depart. The turn is measured, not abrupt, like a dancer choosing a new direction without breaking the line of breath. After the hinge, the housekeeping of light begins. Observers compare inbound chemistry to outbound chemistry, as if reading an old book, before and after a rain. Ratios that hint at birthplace or processing history may shift with exposure, or they may refuse to budge. Either way, the geometry has already offered its sentence. This visit is singular. Instruments then add marginalia, faint. Water signatures here, carbon-bearing traces there, a shoulder in a line that may be artifact or clue. The margins do not overrule the sentence. They ornament it with possibilities. Past the orbit of Earth, the tail thins again. The coma loosens its hold. Sunlight grows more oblique in the mathematics of distance. The open curve takes on that almost immaterial look of a rule drawn lightly across a dark page. It points outward, but outward is not a place. It is an allowance. Beyond the heliopause stretches a climate of charged particles and weak fields and distances so wide that meaning must change shape to travel them. The traveler enters that climate without fanfare, carrying the quiet arithmetic of its motion like a folded map that needs no ink. Symmetry returns in gentle ways. Inbound and outbound speeds match at infinity. Directions reverse, not magnitudes, like two equal breaths separated by a pause. The turn near the sun is proportioned. It neither hesitates nor hurries. Even the uncertainties shrink symmetrically as data accumulates, as if the arithmetic were practicing equilibrium. Human days echo this. Arrivals mirrored by departures, beginnings rhymed with endings, certainties loosening into questions that keep the same weight, only facing the other way. The curve becomes a small mirror in the sky for the decorum of change. Somewhere, a chalkboard still holds the faint dust of a hyperbola drawn earlier in the evening. Somewhere else, a graph window waits with residuals small enough to make someone smile. Somewhere, a listener lies quiet, breathing with the cadence of the curve. Faster near the light, slower in the long dark. The narrator offers nothing more than this. The form of the path is enough to sit with. It carries a kindness toward uncertainty. It leaves room for what is not yet measured. It sketches an ethics of visiting and letting go. And then it continues, the way sleep continues after thought has put down its tools. The old telescope keeps its vigil above weather and politics, placed in the long blue of low Earth orbit, where day and night alternate like measured breaths. It turns with ceremonial slowness, reaction wheels murmuring, star trackers cross-checking the world's small sway against a catalog of fixed lights. In that poised stillness, the mirror comes to rest, and the pale traveler resolves as a tender grain of brightness, a soft condensation anchored in a wider glow. The instrument does not chase spectacle. It keeps company with quiet. Photons fall through baffled darkness and tip into wells, and the wells deepen into numbers, and the numbers soften into a picture that asks to be read gently. Optics touch the image with their signature, a tiny, symmetrical flower that the point-spread function always draws. Petals faint, core gentle, edges honest. Free of air and tremor, the view keeps its promise, and details hold as if the sky concedes a few extra heartbeats of steadiness. Around the hidden nucleus, the syllable the image cannot pronounce, the coma opens like breath made visible. Brightness grades away in a smooth decline, a law written not in chalk but in the way light thins with distance, the way memory thins without ever quite leaving. The camera reads in broad, careful bands, blue, green, red, sometimes a brush of near ultraviolet that grazes the edge of human sight. Each exposure remains brief enough to keep the traveler from smearing, yet long enough to let faintness step forward. Between frames, cosmic rays write thin, straight confessions that later software removes with tact, restoring what the sky meant to say. Drizzle recombines the undersampled picture. Deconvolution nudges the edges toward honesty without carving them into fiction. The result keeps its humility, like a sketch made by patient hands that trust the subject to remain itself. Color breathes in small differences that speak softly. If the coma reddens with distance from the center, grains may be sorting themselves under sunlight, large and darker lingering near, small and reflective wandering outward. If the inner haze looks nearly neutral while the rim leans warm, perhaps heat selects which dust leaves first and which chooses to stay. Hints like these do not harden into doctrine. They settle like silt in a reflecting pool. Someone writes a slope in careful numbers and finds a little peace in the slope. Someone else simply watches and feels the atmosphere of the thing. Beyond the coma, a narrow tail extends anti-solar, a page gently turned by pressure from light itself. Radiation persuades small grains more than large ones, arranging time by size into a long filigree. The larger particles keep nearer the path. The fine ones drift outward, answerable to photons that never touch yet always insist. The old telescope records this lace with monastic restraint. The tail does not shout. It leans away like grass in a steady breeze, a patience written in kilometers, a parable of how a body lets go and still remains a body. The scene invites subtraction. Remove the symmetric glow of the coma in the mind's eye, and asymmetries appear, as though faint jets write their notes in the margins. A wedge of enhanced brightness hints at a vent facing the sun, or a slope warmed past its threshold, or a brief moment when heat finds a seam and opens it. In another filter, the hint fades, or it strengthens. Nothing insists. The traveler continues its exhale, the instrument continues its listening, and between them a negotiation produces images that feel both precise and tender. Brightness becomes distance by way of calibration. Standard stars anchor the scale, flats smooth the field, darks remind the instrument what nothing looks like. From these gentlenesses emerges a number with an old consonant-heavy name, a way to compare comae without scolding them into sameness. The number does not judge. It only says how much scattering surface hides within a chosen circle of attention. As days pass, the value breathes. It rises with the sun's closeness, then softens, then steadies, like a tide that belongs as much to the moon as to the sea. Rotation whispers at the edge of detection. If the brightness fluctuates with a rhythm, slow and then slower still, the nucleus may be turning, showing different faces to light, or the jet's pulse. Or coincidence arranges noise into an imitation of pattern. The telescope does not argue. It gathers more nights, and the curve either remembers its cycle or lets it go. In this way, the instrument practices an ethics of non-insistence, allowing the world to remain proportionate to the evidence it offers and quiet about what it withholds. Within the glimmer, grains carry private histories. Crystalline silicates may hold the memory of warming in some ancient furnace. Amorphous material may recall a cooler workshop where atoms assembled without pattern. Mixed together, they make weather in miniature, Their paths bend under sunlight and solar wind, and the camera freezes one page of that motion, a still frame of drift. The frame is enough to pose a question that remains comfortable without answers. What blend of ice and mineral prepares this? Particular softness of light? When the data assemble into a composite, frames aligned, colors interleaved, artifacts forgiven, the result looks less like a picture and more like breathing that has learned to sit still. The coma glows with centerless tenderness. The tale traces the mind's wish to know where a thing is going, even when the answer is simply outward. The colors keep their modesty. No banner declares certainty. Yet the image feels saturated with meaning the way a pebble from a river holds sun, current, and mountain without needing to explain any of them. On the ground beneath, smaller mirrors and attentive eyes keep parallel watch, their images ruffled by air, yet rich with cadence and continuity. Night after night they measure the same gentle slopes, mark the tale's reach against the background, and fold their counts into the spaceborne view. The chorus matters. Single snapshots become a line, and the line begins to carry time. Together, the instruments make a low, steady music, and in that music the traveler's mood grows legible without hardening into claim. The telescope turns away in its good time, honoring a schedule built from a mosaic of other obligations. Stars, nebulae, galaxies receive their share, but the memory remains lodged in the downlink archive, ready to be revisited by eyes that prefer the slow language of structure without noise. The traveler proceeds. The image abides. Between them, an understanding takes a gentle shape. That seeing, when done without hurry, becomes companionship. That companionship, when kept, becomes a way to live inside unknowing with ease. Far from weather and streetlight bloom, a golden flower waits in the shadow of its own umbrella. A quiet at the Sun-Earth Lagrange point where gravity's balances make a small harbor. The mirror faces the dark with unhurried patience. It does not chase the visitor. It drinks what the visitor sheds of sunlight, gentled into spectra by distance and time. Starlight that has touched ice enters the long tunnels of the instrument and breaks apart into the careful syllables of wavelength, like breath separated into notes a listener can follow with closed eyes. A grid of tiny doors opens and closes. The micro-shutter array deciding which sliver of the coma, which faint ribbon of tail, will be allowed to speak. Each doorway frames a small piece of space. Together they compose a patient mosaic where gas and dust make their brief confessions. In another mode, the spectrograph opens broad arms and receives everything it can at once. The difference is a matter of temperament. Focused listening versus wide listening, both equally polite. The traveler, unaware of the courtesy, continues its soft exhale, and that exhale becomes lines. The lines do not shout. They notch the curve of light the way reeds notch a river's edge. Around 3 microns, a shoulder lifts and settles, as if water clears its throat. A little farther, a deeper hollow suggests the steady geometry of carbon dioxide. Near 5 microns, carbon monoxide lays a varnish of narrow tracks, each one a rung on a molecular ladder warmed into motion. Methane might sketch a quiet pulse, or it might hold back. Other molecules, cousins, isomers, simple chains, hover at the threshold of visibility, present as possibility if not as proof. The narrator allows them all to remain invitations rather than arrivals. Every line is a temperature in disguise, a population of energy levels whispering how recently they were warmed and how much. Ratios between rungs on those ladders make a thermometer of the invisible. If colder, the lower steps hold the crowd. If warmer, the upper steps gather company. The instrument reads that crowding without judgment. A coma at a few hundred Kelvin tells a very different story than a coma at tens of Kelvin, and yet both are ordinary, just chapters in the long conversation between sunlight and ice. The traveler volunteers none of these sentences out loud. Light writes them for it. Dust adds its own dialect. In the near-infrared, grains scatter and glow with the memory of starlight, then gradually yield to warmth and begin to radiate like coals in the far. The continuum swells, and small fingerprints ride on its back. If the grains hold crystalline silicates, a 10-micron psi may rise later with another instrument. If they hold more amorphous forms, the psi may flatten, as if glass prefers to keep its history to itself. The spectrum, which at first felt like a single line of handwriting, reveals itself as a palimpsest. Gas on dust, dust under gas, both revised by distance and time since perihelion's touch. Calibration is a quiet art. The instrument remembers what darkness looks like so that the sky may speak truly. It watches standard stars and learns how to correct for its own way of breathing. Lines are deblurred by a careful estimate of how the optics spread a point into a little cloud. Backgrounds are subtracted without anger, the way one gently clears a table before setting the bread down. What remains is the meal itself, modest and nourishing, a spectrum with enough texture to pose patient questions. One question lingers near the shape of hydrogen and its heavier sibling. If a rare deuterated form of water leaves a trace, what climate of making does it suggest? What nursery temperature? What long freeze? What quiet on the edge of a birthplace far from any sun? The lines required are delicate, and sometimes the airless hush still cannot hear them. It is enough to imagine that such ratios exist, moving within the faintness as seeds move within fruit. If they are measured later, the story may shift in small, satisfying ways. If they remain below hearing, the story keeps its humility intact. Another question rests with carbon's many choices. Chains and rings and small families of atoms compose recipes too simple to call life, yet far from trivial. Acetylene may leave a whisper near 3 microns. Hydrogen cyanide might lean in briefly, then step back. Formaldehyde may be hinted at by the way the continuum lifts and bends. Each potential footprint sits in a thicket of neighbors. Disentangling one from another takes time, model atmospheres, and a willingness to say perhaps. The narrator leaves, each candidate with the dignity of uncertainty, like stones placed in a garden without labels. Wind from the sun adds rhythm. Fluorescent pumping elevates molecules, and their relaxation becomes a set of narrow lanterns along the path of wavelength. Those lanterns brighten and dim with heliocentric distance, with viewing angle, with the subtle choreography of expansion. Speed in the coma. The spectrograph writes those changes into data cubes that feel, in their quiet way, like time-lapse recordings of a breath. Regions closer to the nucleus rise a little warmer, receding cooler, the way steam thins as it climbs. From a cup and forgets the cup. A map emerges. Not a map with borders and roads, but a map of chemistry across a small cloud. One spaxel thickens with water's imprint. An adjacent one leans toward carbon monoxide. Another is mostly dust. The pattern swirls, not dramatically, but with the composure of a pond disturbed by morning insects. If a jet exists, it shows itself as a narrow vein of higher line strength, like a thought that refuses to disperse. The instrument notes it without assigning cause. Local slope, fractured crust, a pocket warmed from within, all remain on the table, each a theory practicing patience. Somewhere in the building of this record, the human wish to measure becomes a wish to know where. Where was the traveler made? Where did it spend its long cold? Where did it learn these ratios? Physics grants a kind of answer, a range of temperatures, a style of illumination, but keeps the coordinates to itself. The narrator finds this comforting. A sky that never exhausts the question of where leaves room for nights like this one, for the slow ease of attention not required to arrive. The instrument takes what time allows, then yields the sunlight to other needs, Galaxies, nurseries, faint exoplanet heirs wait for their turns. The spectrum is boxed in numbers and sent down as whispers inside radio, then kept in an archive that does not mind being forgotten for a while. Later, analysts reopen it and let the lines breathe in new models, new calibrations, new shared hunches. The traveler, by then farther and quieter, is still present in the record, an ice-turned vowel held in a patient mouth. Across this listening, the tone remains kind. It does not press the comet for novelty, nor the data for spectacle. It accepts that most of the lines belong to ordinary molecules doing ordinary things under light. It accepts, too, that ordinary does not mean empty. The commonplace chemistry of ices contains the patience of clouds, the temper of furnaces long extinguished, the old news of a galaxy that keeps writing similar stories with different authors. If a line arrives that feels out of place, the response is not alarm, but breath. Slow checking, gentle recalibration, a willingness to let the anomaly be a teacher or a mirage. In the quiet, after the instrument turns away, the spectrum lingers. In the mind, like a low, continuous chord. It is not a verdict on origin, not a certificate of otherness. It is a companionship of light with matter and of attention with both. The traveler knows nothing of it. The listener knows enough that the sky can be read as softly as it is looked at, that understanding can take the form of a lullaby, and that a line on a graph can rock the body towards sleep as surely as a wave touching shore, again and again, without hurry, without end. The tale begins as hesitation. It is not a banner unfurled, but a suggestion at the edge of visibility, a slow brightening where sunlight touches grains that have just remembered how to leave. Sublimation opens pores. At the nucleus, like tiny springs at snowmelt, gas slips free and takes hold of motes that once slept in darkness. What was bound becomes provisional. What was hidden gathers a little distance and finds itself written into space as a soft, persistent line. Heat does not argue, it invites. Under that invitation, memory climbs out of the solid and drifts. Radiation pushes with a pressure too gentle, for hands to feel yet decisive across the small lives of dust. Each grain accepts a different measure of persuasion. Large fragments keep the old discipline of inertia. They linger near the path the nucleus takes and trace an afterimage of its motion. Small ones, fragments lighter than breath, soot dark, or glass pale, yield to photons with surprising loyalty and peel away into a broader fan. The result is not one line but a layered calligraphy, a spine near the orbit, a plume pressed anti-solar, a fine lace of curves that record size as distance, time as angle. Somewhere in the patient work, a model waits like a river map. In quiet arithmetic, the family of curves branches and converges. Synchrones radiate from moments of release. Syndines gather grains of equal persuasion into shared paths. Together, they form a language of memory and mass. The tale's shape becomes a timeline written in light pressure and gravity, a diary of pulses at the nucleus, a record of when surfaces cross their thresholds and let go. The narrator lingers with the image of those families of lines overlaid on the sky, ghostly ribs beneath the flesh of brightness, then lets it fade, leaving only the sense that structure hides in softness as bones hide in fog. Nearer the sun, the dust brightens with a simple courtesy. More light arrives, more light scatters. Phase angle adds nuance. When the traveler stands between star and observer, forward scattering lifts the tail as if the grains themselves choose to glow from within. When the geometry turns, the glow softens and settles closer to the nucleus. None of this is dramatic. It is weather in the language of optics, an atmosphere spread thin across emptiness, behaving with the same courtesy whether or not anyone watches. The tale lengthens not by ambition, but by accumulation. Each hour writes a little more distance, as steady as a tide line expanding on a flat shore. The other tale, if it forms, keeps to a different ethic. Ions, stripped and light, are led by fields rather than by photons, and so their blue-cold filament points like a compass needle, straight, decisive, sometimes kinked by the wrinkles of a living solar wind. Dust curves with time, plasma points with electricity. The dust's patience and the ion's urgency share the same source yet tell different truths. In some geometries, the two overlap and masquerade. In others, they separate like voices in a duet, one a breathy alto, the other a slender, unbending line. The narrative makes room for both without asking them to agree. Jets, if they exist, imprint the tale with local signatures. A vent, facing. The light may write a brighter vein through the fan, a narrow stripe that persists for days and then dissolves as the spin changes orientation. Another may open briefly at a ridge and send a snow of grains into one quadrant of the coma, sculpting the tail's base as asymmetry. The nucleus turns, gentle and unhurried, and the pattern drifts like a hand moving through incense smoke. If rotation can be guessed at by the breathing of brightness, it can sometimes be felt here as rhythm, a faint regularity in the way the plume thickens and thins, like a pulse under a blanket. Distances soften fear. Even as grains leave, the small body remains itself. Cohesion holds, fractures creep at their own scales, and the tail's growth is not a prelude to breaking but a companion to surviving the sunward bend. Meter-sized chunks may bud off and travel parallel for a while, each a quiet moonletting. Pebble clouds may form and fade. Most of the mass, though, stays home beneath the exhale, as if the object practices generosity without self-erasure. Loss becomes a kind of script that does not diminish the speaker, a faint shedding by which a story can be told. Color leans warm with distance from the core if larger, darker grains dominate the inner cloud and fine dust walks outward like ash. In certain filters, a reddening slope grows, then flattens. Elsewhere, the neutral hush of nearly gray scattering holds. Minerals add their subtleties. A hint of crystalline order in some grains may shift a small feature at longer wavelengths. Amorphous glass remembers supercooled birth and keeps its own counsel. The tail thus reads like sediment layered by a river that changes its feed with the season, now rock flour, now sand, now whispers of organic soot carried out of winter. Meteor trails and showers belong to families that return. This visitor's path does not. The dust it leaves will not yield a calendar for future skies. Instead, the grains dilute into the wide zodiacal hush, a temporary contribution to the faint brightness that keeps nights from perfect black. Some motes may wander for decades within the heliosphere before their orbits and sizes carry them to disassembly, sputtered by wind, warmed to transparency, or folded into other dust. A few may cross orbits that intersect Earth and fall as unnoticed whispers into ocean and desert. If so, they join a democratic archive. Micrometeorites gathered in ice, in gutters, in deep-sea mud, their origins mingled beyond confident untangling. The thought brings no proof, only a small feeling of kinship with the anonymous. A geometry sometimes draws an anti-tail, an illusion of brightness pointing sunward, not from gas but from the aligned plane of large grains lingering near the orbital path. Perspective stacks bodies along a thin sheet, and the stack becomes a spear of light that appears to deny the usual order. The sky is kind about such confusions. It allows paradox at one angle and clarifies at another. The narrator appreciates this courtesy, the way space forgives the eye for seeing with context and not just with optics, the way a mistaken reading can be beautiful and harmless, like a mirage remembered fondly after water is found. As days pass, production rises and falls. The heat that coaxes water may later unlock carbon dioxide from deeper stores and, later, still whisper to carbon monoxide that has waited for tighter cold. Each species carries a different threshold, and the tale becomes a ledger of which thresholds have been crossed. Outbound, the accounting changes again. The innermost ices retire. First, the deeper, more volatile guests keep their soft work a little longer. The tail thins, the fan narrows, and the synchrones that once sprawled like opened fingers curl back toward the path, as if the hand were closing. It is not regret. It is simply distance. Brightness curves flatten in the archives. Images line up in gentle sequences where the fan grows, holds, and fades. From these, a small harvest of numbers emerges: dust production estimates, effective cross-sections, slopes of size distributions. They carry authority without command. They do not solve origin, but they refine temperament. The tail's behavior becomes a portrait of the traveler's surface habits: how readily grains are lifted, how sticky the crust remains, how patchy the vents, how practiced the body is at visiting fire and leaving again. All of this, the push of light, the hush of grains, the field lines guiding ions, the perspective tricks and calibrations, whispers the same gentle sentence: leaving can be luminous. The tail is a way of parting that registers as radiance, a soft algebra of loss that turns to beauty without asking permission. In that algebra, time and distance exchange places. What was a minute of heat at the nucleus becomes hundreds of thousands of kilometers of pale handwriting in the dark. The handwriting persists just long enough to be read by patient eyes and then diffuses into general night, where it joins the quieter scripts of interplanetary dust and memory. The narrator lets the image hold, an ever-lengthening veil, a thought taking form and then thinning until even the thought is mostly space. The traveler continues on its unclosing curve. The sun recedes, the pressure lessens, the tail relaxes, its posture and dissolves into scale. Nothing has been claimed. Something has been shared. A record remains, more suggestion than statement, sufficient for sleep. Chemistry wakes like dawn on a frost field. First a pallor, then faint color, then the slow articulation of shape. Near the traveler, sunlight seeps through porous crust and loosens small congregations of molecules that have slept for spans beyond calendar. The release does not clap or flare. It breathes. A few families step forward first, the ones that require less warmth to move, unassuming guests whose thresholds were set in a climate now far away in both distance and memory. Other families wait for deeper coaxing, listening for a more generous hour of heat. In this staggered procession, a portrait begins, not of what the object is absolutely, but of how it becomes itself under light. Ratios serve as the gentle grammar of that portrait. Water, the common voice, rises when the sun grows persuasive, and around that voice quieter companions gather. Carbon dioxide makes a steady, cool syllable. Carbon monoxide overlays a thinner, more distant vowel. Smaller chains and whispering radicals taste the light and slip into visibility for a time, then fall back into anonymity. The narrator holds these relationships the way one holds river stones: cool, smooth, different in weight and color, each telling a little of where it has come from without insisting on a map. Instruments translate this wakefulness into lines and slopes. One line deepens as heliocentric distance shrinks, another resists, another appears only after the bend near the sun. To the patient eye, this choreography looks like memory remembering its layers. Some stores sit near the surface and answer quickly to the day. Others hide within slabs that only later admit the warmth, so that the outbound leg of the journey carries signatures that did not present inbound. The traveler's exhale thus holds a time dimension within itself: the near past of fresh sunlight, the recent past of heat diffusing through crust, the deep past of formation temperatures written in ratios that do not care about the sun of this week. A quiet speculation unfolds here, as a paper-thin leaf turning in air. If certain volatiles appear in abundance beyond what experience with local comets would predict, or if their scarcity feels unusual, then perhaps the guest grew up differently. Colder nursery, warmer nursery, a history of irradiation, a youthful tumble among siblings that retextured its skin. The sense of elsewhere wraps itself not in spectacle but in the ordinary arithmetic of mixing. Gas-to-dust ratios take their slow breaths. Production curves lean toward one shape rather than another. A picture forms that points not to a claim but to a climate, a background field of temperature and light in which these molecules learned their thresholds. The narrator lets the mind drift to a distant disk of gas and dust around another new star, long since gone dim from this horizon of time. In that far ring, rays slant shallowly across a plain of grains. Beyond a line of frost, water solidifies into soft architecture and takes 1,000 different futures, amorphous to crystalline, fractured to sintered, glass to powder, depending on the pace of warming and the company of minerals. Carbon dioxide condenses in places cooler still. Carbon monoxide prefers the deepest winter of space. If a body assembles where these ices lie ready, it inherits their temperaments. Ratios become heirlooms. The thought rests there, light as pollen, and does not press. Closer to the skin of the traveler, small theaters play at different depths. A brittle lid may cover a more porous interior, so that jets originate where cracks allow newer warmth to intersect older stores. In those narrow columns, chemistry can skew. Some species escape first, others remain trapped, and the expanding gas fractionates grains by size. The coma becomes a patchwork, and the patchwork keeps changing. Spectra measured across the face of the envelope tell on this motion without needing to name it. Here, water finds a corridor. There, carbon dioxide stands in for a still-shy aquifer. Elsewhere, carbon monoxide continues to whisper, patient as deep shade. The long transit through space between stars also leaves its faint touch. Irradiation by ancient cosmic rain can tease oxygen out of water to make short-lived radicals, can turn simple chains into slightly darker, more complex soot, can anneal ice into subtler structures that alter how it releases what it holds. None of this arrives as an announcement. It arrives as small changes in slopes, in the relative heights of neighboring lines, in the way dust warms and cools against the continuum. Each change suggests a history not of drama but of exposure, like driftwood slightly polished beyond the level of the season's waves. With patience, production rates align themselves into families of plots that breathe with distance from the sun. The water line rises, peaks, and eases. Carbon dioxide lags or leads. Carbon monoxide keeps a slower cadence, more faithful to deep storage than to surface weather. If the inbound curve differs from the outbound curve, the quiet phenomenon called asymmetry, then the body teaches that it is not a sphere of uniform sleep but a small landscape with morning and evening faces, with slopes and hollows, with histories of past perihelia printed as patches of sinter and crust. The narrator allows that landscape to exist without coordinates, content with the knowledge that temperament itself can be measured. Temperature hides in distributions. Populations of molecules at different energy levels reveal how hot the immediate breath has become. Expansion speeds translate pressure into motion. The numbers marry to form a believable intimacy. A coma warm near the nucleus, cooler outward. A velocity field that remembers both the vigor of release and the restraint of vacuum. No map places this comet in a particular birthplace by these alone. They only draw the outlines of plausible childhoods. The modesty soothes. Sleep comes easier when knowledge admits its edges. Beyond molecules, grains carry a content older than the coma. Minerals speak without words about furnaces and shade. If crystalline signatures later appear at longer wavelengths, they suggest that some portion of the dust once visited warmth sufficient to order its lattice, perhaps near a young star or within an energetic pocket of a turbulent disk. If the dust reads as more amorphous, glass-like, it hints at fast cooling, at being frozen in the middle of a gesture. In either case, the tale becomes a release not only of mass but of biography, the slow telling of a life assembled from temperatures, pressures, and patient, unobserved rehearsals. In the spaces between data, a terrestrial question quietly returns like a tide. On Earth, how much of a civilization's breath would remain after 10 million years of rain, plates, and bacteria? Would its chemistry be legible as a faint perturbation in sediments, a small tilt in stable isotopes, a handful of synthetics passing through time as fossils of industry? The narrator keeps the question unarmed, gentle, content to let it rest, beside cometary ratios as a parallel rather than a proof. Both interstellar dust and human trace speak of climates, some stellar, some planetary, in which matter arranges and rearranges its tendencies. Occasionally, a line appears where none is expected or fails to appear where one is anticipated. This is where the tone stays kindest. An anomaly becomes a lesson in patience before it becomes a claim. It asks for calibration, for alternate explanations, for gentle attempts to reproduce. Many such lines return to ordinary after a slower look. A few remain interesting the way a stone remains interesting after the stream has turned. In the archive, the record keeps both the settled and the unsettled with equal courtesy. Outbound, the convoy of molecules thins. Water dials its breath down first. Carbon dioxide keeps a little longer. Carbon monoxide lingers like a thought that refuses to dissolve at once. Ratios drift toward their quiet endings, and the coma contracts, and what was bright becomes delicate, then simply present, then almost not there. Yet in this softness a clarity persists. The chemistry has shown a temperament, and temperament suggests a past, the way posture suggests a mood. A climate of making has been glimpsed, not with coordinates, but with tendencies, and that is enough to place the traveler in the family of worlds that know frost and light, absence and approach. The narrator lets the image fade to a simple arrangement. A small body, a thin breath, a handful of lines on a dark field. Somewhere, numbers rest in a table. Somewhere else, a mind turns them into a paragraph that asks less than it offers. The sky continues the conversation without raising its voice. The traveler continues on its unclosing path. In the quiet, chemistry becomes a kind of lullaby, repeating soft ratios until even the ratios are only rhythm, and the rhythm is only ease. Isotopes speak in quiet accents, the same words of matter pronounced with slightly different weight. One atom is light, another heavy by a single neutron, and between them a history becomes audible. The traveler exhales this accent into light, and instruments, leaning close, try to hear which syllables lengthen and which soften. Ratios take the place of clocks. They do not tell hours, they tell climates of making, distances from heat, the patience of cold laboratories where molecules learn their thresholds. Deuterium leans gently against hydrogen like a winter shawl on a summer shoulder. In deep cold, deuterium slips more easily into bonds, and the D to H ratio rises as if frost is taking notes. Warmer places push the ratio back toward a simpler tune. If the coma reveals even a hint of this balance, a temperature sketch appears. Not a map, but a mood. The traveler's water, bound in an ancient nursery, remembers how low the thermostat once was set. The thought hovers without declaring where that nursery stands. Oxygen adds a finer embroidery. In the protoplanetary hush, light at certain wavelengths breaks carbon monoxide and water with a bias that depends on abundance and shadow. Self-shielding protects the common isotopes first. Rare ones feel the blow longer, and their fragments seed ices with slightly different oxygen signatures. Later, those signatures thread through the small body like pale veins. A spectrum tonight may not separate them cleanly, yet the idea rests with a pleasant weight that even atoms keep diaries. Carbon's ratio, 13 to 12, usually keeps near a familiar value, a galactic accent that rarely surprises. That steadiness comforts. It implies kinship across distances, a shared hum in the background song of star-making. Nitrogen behaves more wayward. 15 to 14 can wander by chemistry and cold, rising in neutrals during long winters, speaking of paths where atomic nitrogen and carbon met under dim lamps of scattered light. If those voices reach the instrument, they hint at corners of origin hidden from maps. Noble gases practice deep memory. Argon, krypton, xenon, reluctant to bind, freeze only when the nursery air turns strict with chill. Their presence in ice says that the pantry stood open to even the shyest guests. Their isotopes recall older histories still, echoes of supernova ash and old stellar winds mixed into the nebula long before any disk condensed. In the traveler's breath, such whispers would be faint to the edge of hearing, yet the possibility itself comforts. A small comet can carry a parliament of ancestries, voices that agree to share the same small breath. Fractionation continues after formation. Sublimation favors light over heavy by a hair's breadth. The early vapor goes lean. The residue grows, rich. As day touches the nucleus, a transient enrichment may build in the ice left behind, only to be reset as sunset returns on the outbound leg. In the coma, collisions and sunlight begin their gentle remixing. What the instrument hears tonight is not a pure inheritance, but a present tense shaped by ancient grammar. The partial truth feels honest, the way a shoreline remains honest even when the tide is out. Sometimes the ratios differ inbound and outbound, a quiet asymmetry that belongs to landscape. A sunward slope with thin crust answers quickly, venting water with a D to H close to the ancestral blend. A shadowed basin releases later, drawing from a deeper pantry where slow fractionation has tilted the mix. The light reads both and writes them as neighboring numbers. The difference does not demand a theory, it offers a contour. The traveler is not uniform, it is a weathered particular body practicing its own weather. Beyond the comet's little climate, galactic time turns the dials. Generations of stars enrich the medium with heavier isotopes. Others thin them by fusion and wind. In presolar grains on Earth, tiny crystals of silicon carbide and graphite wear extravagant isotopic fashions, garments cut in stellar houses and stitched into meteorites long before oceans begin. Such grains remind attention that every ratio is a palimpsest, layered across scales from nucleus to arm of galaxy. The traveler, exhaling tonight, becomes a moving page in that layered book. Terrestrial archives keep an answering music. In ice cores, deuterium marks past temperatures. Shells, oxygen remembers seawater and season. In recent centuries, the carbon of air has lightened as fossil breath climbs the atmosphere, an isotopic tilt that writes history without letters. Other signatures exist, faint and specific, that drift through sediments and rings. The narrator keeps these side by side with comet ratios, not as accusation or proof, but as two ways matter records its weather, one planetary, one cometary. Measurement itself teaches humility. High resolution helps, yet lines blend. Sensitivities fall short. Fluorescence lifts some transitions and hides others. Models lean in with their own accents, and analysts learn to hear through the overlay. The virtue remains in the posture, asking the sky politely and being content with a murmur. If later instruments separate the syllables more cleanly, tonight's listening stays true because it kept pace with what the light was willing to say. In this patience, other ratios wait their turn. Sulfur speaks in 34 to 32. Chlorine carries 37 to 35. Even the distribution of spin states in molecules remembers the cold of first sleep. Each thread, if one could follow it uninterrupted from nursery to coma, would sketch a long curve through environments, as if a single melody modulated across keys. Following such a melody in full may not be possible, yet the glimpse suffices. Knowledge does not need closure to be generous. The traveler does not know it carries clocks. It merely warms and releases, while numbers line quietly along axes. Those axes, in turn, do not know the urgency sometimes tied to them. Tonight, they serve a different vocation. They slow the breathing of thought. They allow the mind to rest on a likeness. That time, in the sky, wears many faces, and one of them looks like a ratio that refuses to rush. In the long outbound, the signatures relax. Heavy and light blend back toward the average that follows distance. Reactions fade. Lines thin. What remains is the idea, intact, that matter remembers the temperatures it has known, the lights that have touched it, the kinships it has kept. The narrator lets that idea settle like dust in still air. It feels older than argument. It feels sufficient for sleep. Dust resembles ancient snow, not in temperature but in temperament. It gathers quietly, it drifts, it remembers the shape of the air that carries it. Near the traveler, grains leave their long sleep with the caution of creatures stepping from shade. Some arrive as single crystals, compact and sure. Others appear as airy congregations, fractal as frost ferns, clusters held together by small kindnesses of force. Porosity becomes a mood. A flake that is mostly space reflects light differently than a bead, mostly body. And the sky, patient with differences, lets both speak at once. Light tries on the grains and discovers many faces. At small phase angles, a tender surge rises, as if the dust returns a last, shy brightness when the observer stands nearly behind the sun. Polarization deepens with angle, then relaxes again, an optical breathing that confesses roughness and void, without naming either. Nothing here insists on a conclusion. Texture, even at the scale of microns, has weather. It changes with angle, with time since release, with the invisible tug of fields and the slow coercion of light. The narrator lets that weather move across the mind like a front that does not hurry, bringing scent before rain and coolness after. A few grains come close enough to be weighed by instruments that catch without crushing. They fall into small cups and tap out their energy like soft punctuation. They kiss sticky plates and keep their delicate architecture. They build minute drifts on collectors designed to listen to the quiet. Some fragments break, proving their tenderness. Others hold together like crumbs of old kiln. Under patient eyes, the pieces seem built from sub-pieces, as if a history of gentle collisions and even gentler adhesions has assembled villages from cottages, cottages from rooms, rooms from beams. The architecture is temporary, but not trivial. A broken aggregate becomes smaller aggregates and monomers that still remember edges. Mineralogy carries moods older than the comet. Tiny crystals of olivine and pyroxene suggest excursions to warmth, perhaps near a young star or inside pockets where shocks forged order. Glacier fragments hold metal and sulfide sewn through like dusk in clear ice, a memory of cooling so quick it preserved confusion. Between them lie darker, carbon-rich crumbs, complex and stubborn, the color of steeped leaves. They are not life. They are not its denial. They are the patient alphabet from which many stories can be tried. Under sunlight, those stories do not become sentences. They remain letters murmuring possibilities. A question leans in and stays soft. How do bodies as frail as these dust villages survive the long drift between suns? Perhaps the gentleness of vacuum protects what is fragile. Perhaps porosity forgives stress by yielding. A puff of gas lifts them, a photon persuades them. A weak tide of charged wind sets a rhythm, and still they keep their loose architecture. When they do break, they break into familiars, not strangers. Smaller clusters bearing the same habits, solitary grains retaining the angles of their former alliances. Motion here is a rehearsal for later sediments, an audition for archives, yet unnamed. On Earth, small repositories welcome the anonymous. Snowfields gather micrometeorites and keep them for careful hands. Polar winds concentrate dark specks against bright ice. Deep-sea mud writes a ledger under pressure and time. In those quiet places, some grains carry the same mineral alphabets, the same glassy hints, the same carbon dark patience. Others melt to spheres during their fall, recording a brief fever as a polished skin. A few, altered by water and weather, tell of having touched a world that is never still. These terrestrial guests do not confess origin easily. Their biographies are mingled. Yet the resemblance to comet dust feels like two distant dialects sharing certain vowels. The grains around. The traveler also practices shadow. Within porous clusters, sunlight penetrates and warms interiors unevenly. Outward faces radiate their heat to space while inward corners hold the day. This thermal patchwork changes how gases cling and leave, how grains chatter against one another, how long a cluster resists dissolution. Even the way they spin matters. A slow tumble exposes new microclimates to vacuum, and the balance between heating and cooling writes third and fourth place decimals into production rates that will later be read as temperament. The overall effect is modest, but modesty here is cumulative. Small differences summate into moods. Far from the present light, similar grains once grew from motes in a flattened cloud around a young star. They met in collisions too slow to be called impacts, held, rolled, and either bounced free or stayed as pairs. Over and over they chose adhesion and became aggregates that gas could carry, drifting inward or outward depending on size and coupling. A barrier lived in that nursery between sticking and bouncing and breakage, yet small rearrangements, frost on surfaces, a rim of organics, a whisper of electrostatic charge, nudged outcomes toward growth. The path from mote to pebble is a literature of almosts. The comet remembers the chapters that paused. Light scattering writes biography in hue. If the coma reddens with distance from the nucleus, larger and darker grains may be lingering while smaller, brighter flecks journey farther. If color stays nearly neutral, perhaps the mix keeps its balance. Polarization curves that dip toward negative values at very small angles hint at surfaces so rough and porous that simple models miss their grace. Models reply with patience, solving for size distributions that often follow a power law, many small, few large, then bending where cohesion and sunlight conspire to edit extremes. None of these numbers presses for drama. They accrue like rings, in a tree that does not mind being counted. Fragments of organics complicate the light with a velvet dimness. They carry rings and chains, bonds broken and remade by radiation, simple sugar's cousins and acid's grandparents, none of it arranged as a claim, all of it arranged as a possibility. Under warmth, such fragments may soften the sticking of grains. Under cold, they may stiffen, protecting cavities where volatiles bide their time. The chemistry of aggregation is thus also a chemistry of patience. Surfaces become hospitable by degrees, then reluctant by other degrees, a conversation, conducted at the pace of light absorbed and released. When dust meets instruments designed to taste, the imprint reads like a pantry quietly inventoried. Sodium glows here, a faint spice. Sulfur mutters there. Magnesium, iron, and silicon form a sturdy backbone for stones seen in miniature. Carbon speaks many dialects at once. Chlorine and phosphorus visit in lean phrases. If certain salts ride, along they enter without ceremony, a reminder that water stories can unfold on scales too small for maps. None of this asks for a headline. It asks for a breath held a little longer than usual, then released. In the wake of the tale, grains become their own travelers, no longer speaking for the nucleus but for themselves. Some will spiral into wider orbits under sunlight's persuasion. Some will intersect the paths of planets as neglectable snow. Some will fold into the broad geometry of the interplanetary dust cloud and add a faint milk to night. A very few will land as glints on a wet rock or a windowsill, proof only that the sky shares. The thought is consoling. Sharing, at this scale, leaves almost nothing poorer. A terrestrial question returns like a low tide easing across flats. If an earlier chapter of planetary industry ever wrote itself into dust, what would its grains look like after oceans, weather, and burial had their slow say? Would porosity survive compression? Would glass remember its shock? Would unusual alloys keep their accents, or would chemistry and fire translate them into a more ordinary tongue? The narrator keeps the questions soft. The comet's dust does not answer, yet it models a kind of forgetting that is also remembering. Structures relax, edges round, but certain ratios, certain textures, certain shy colors persist. Outbound, the coma thins and the grains disperse into their chosen freedoms. The traveler grows fainter, the push of light grows kinder, collisions slow to almost nothing. What remains is a feeling, as tactile as sleep, that snow, which never was snow, has taught a practice of listening. It suggests that softness and strength are not opposites, that a thing mostly made of space can carry history sturdily, that letting go can be a way of keeping. The mind leans into that practice as the body settles. Dust keeps drifting, and with it drifts the idea that gentleness, given enough distance and time, can become a map. A question walks in on quiet feet and takes a seat beside the traveler's dust. If a planet briefly builds fire into cities and then forgets, what remains in stone and sea after the forgetting completes its work? The room keeps its hush. The narrator does not lean forward. The question does not ask for answer. It shares a shoreline with imagination and geology, a place where waves erase but also deposit. The traveler from elsewhere provides a mirror, not a proof, a way to compare kinds of memory written into matter under conditions no tribunal can cross-examine. He lets the scene become ocean. It is late, yet the abyssal plains never sleep. Silts drift down like slow snow, snow that remembers continents in every grain. Microfossils stack their white arithmetic into drifts that resolve into limestone, given patience. Clay carries the gossip of rivers. Volcanic ash arrives in sudden, thin pages. In between, there are soft intervals darker than others, intervals when oxygen falters and the sea forgets to ventilate its depths. Against this slow ledger, a brief industrial century, or even a brief industrial million years, becomes a blush, a nudge, a tilt in ratios that might resemble other tilts born of climate and fire. He considers what vanishes first. Steel returns. To ore's humility. Copper oxidizes and wanders. Concrete relaxes into aggregate. Wood becomes soil unless sealed by accident. Plastics reshape into waxes and crumbs, then into molecules that drift or bind. Some sink with algae, some raft into gyres, some enter mud and wait for burial's chemistry to begin the long conversion into simpler, quieter forms. Pigments fade. Synthetics lose their names. If any signatures remain after weather and tectonics have practiced their editing, they live as small and statistical, like a persistent whisper inside a choir. Unusual polymers broken to familiar fragments. A suite of halogens out of place, a distribution of carbon chain lengths tilted in a way not easily explained by biology alone. He imagines deeper persistence. Ratios shift in air and ocean when a species exhales long-stored carbon. Lighter carbon climbs skyward, and that lightness passes into leaves and shells, into snow of plankton, into teeth and stalagmites. Heavy metals migrate along industries, gradients, then smear and mix, but some settle among clays and bind to sulfide shadows where oxygen forgets to reach. Rare earths, catalysts, alloy recipes. Tiny accents may remain in sediments that find anoxic havens. A fragment of circuit grows anonymous, but its chemistry lingers as a mood. Even then, the planet edits with enthusiasm. Rivers rearrange their alphabet. Subduction folds pages under molten revision. The traveler re-enters the mind as a calibration. Interstellar dust arrives with its own biographies, grains that know temperatures beyond our star, ices that learned their manners under, different winters, carbon that endured eons of radiation without dissolving into chaos. When such grains fall through the solar wind, they do not bring stories in words. They bring survival curves. Some structures last under vacuum, under cold, under occasional heat. Others surrender early. By comparing what strangers preserve with what Earth keeps, one can draw a soft boundary around the possible. A sense of which molecular architectures endure past weather, which sink, which rise to light and are broken again. It is not evidence. It is proportion. A scale held up to the dark to guess at sizes hidden from sight. He imagines a core sample raised from silence, the cylinder of time read like a slow flute. There are layers where climate tips toward warmth and then retreats, layers where bones grow scarce because oxygen has left the deep, layers where volcanic breath settles its dark pollen. If a brief industry exists in this column, it may look like one of these, an excursion without a caption, a burst of carbon with light isotopes, a spike of nitrogen from fertilizers that pass through fields into rivers into sea, a scattering of spheres formed in fire's updrafts, cousins to natural soot, traces of long-lived molecules invented for convenience that now copy the obstinacy of minerals. Nothing here proves an author. Each line is a suggestion. The difficulty is precisely the point. Nature rehearses the same notes. He walks through the counterpoint of forgetting. Continents drift with slow grace. Oceans grow new floors and eat the old. Mountain belts rise under stress and weather into deltas that soothe the sea with sediment. Deserts migrate. Ice retires and returns. Across such movements, technosignatures would need to be as stubborn as zircons to outlast the bookbinding. Few things are. Even zircon, that tiny archivist, remembers mostly heat and age, not cities. So the mind learns to appreciate the humility of inference. It learns to be content with possibilities weighted by their plausibility rather than lifted by certainty. Sleep prefers this gentleness. He considers the silhouette of silence. If an earlier chapter of Making and Burning once flickers on Earth, it may mimic the signatures of other ancient flares. A warming that peaks and settles, an oxygen dip in the sea, a brief bloom of carbon-loving plankton, a rearrangement of clay. Mineralogy, as weather changes the pace of rivers. The long tail of plastics and compounds designed to last could fold into residues recognizable only as persistent, and not as made, the way a shadow tells little about the object casting. He imagines a laboratory centuries hence, or millions, holding a microgram of black crumb and arguing, kindly, about whether the carbon rings here prefer to be called industrial, or combusted, or simply old. He turns the attention back to the traveler, whose dust teaches a specific patience. Organic fragments arrive that are neither life nor its denial, that carry catalytic possibility without narration. Minerals arrive that speak of warmth and quench, of order and glass. Tiny salts whisper of water's past presence in cracks too small for maps. All these survive radiation's page-by-page editing, survive unmonitored centuries, survive the particular cold of interstellar distance. They show that certain kinds of structure keep their posture even after the story that made them has ended. If a planet's industry once wrote itself into the sky as dust, perhaps the fragments that persist bear witness not in headlines, but in the stubbornness of certain bonds. He thinks of technosignatures made not for sight, but for endurance. enriched isotopes in a narrow band of time, an odd clump of alloy spherules smoothed by ocean, a sequence of halogenated chains almost, but not quite, like natural cousins, a layer where silica carries microbubbles shaped by rapid cooling from temperatures usually found only near lightning and volcanoes but found here in wider geography, as if ovens had joined storms. Each of these can be mimicked by nature. Each can be distinguished only by context and concentration. The mood remains inquiry, not verdict. Earth's archive is generous but also choral. One voice rarely sings alone. He returns to the patient arithmetic of absence. So much of a planet's surface is rewritten. Even in the calmest basins, compaction and diagenesis mix the script. Pores close, minerals swap partners, organic remnants cross thresholds and take new names. What survives does so because new conditions suit it, not because the old story demanded immortality. The lesson is soft and applicable beyond geology. Meaning survives when later climates make it welcome. In the same way, some cometary grains look freshly ancient because the heliosphere grants them a climate of survival. Others we never see because the heliosphere does not. He lets the two archives sit side by side, the solar system's wide bouquet of dust and ice and Earth's deep library of mud and shell. One shows how matter keeps its character through emptiness and light. The other shows how matter loses and regains its character through pressure and water and life. Between them lies a method of imagining, a way to hold the possibility of lost makers without either insisting or dismissing. The traveler contributes a baseline. This is what survives without weather. The ocean contributes another. This is what survives through weather. Their overlap defines a narrow circle of persistence that any fleeting industry must pass through if it wishes a whisper to reach the far future. The whisper does not need to be loud. It needs to be patient, a ratio that leans, a polymer that lingers as ghost, a metallic flavor in clay that persists as a shy aftertaste. Perhaps an interstellar grain falls into the same stratum and confuses the reading. Perhaps it clarifies it. Perhaps it helps calibrate how strong an anomaly must be to rise above the chorus. He does not place his thumb on the scale. He listens, and he invites the listener to do the same. Somewhere, the traveler moves outward, carrying its own quiet history without caring if anyone hears. Somewhere, the ocean throws a dark page onto the continental slope and smooths it with a palm of silt. The two gestures rhyme. Neither demands an audience. Both trust time to edit. The narrator rests in that trust. The room grows dimmer by a shade. The question remains seated, companionable and light, willing to stay open for as long as sleep requires. Light collects the way broken pottery collects in a long abandoned floor, not as a whole vessel, but as edges and curves that imply a shape. The traveler offers such fragments to instruments, lines, dips, small plateaus, pieces of a vessel once continuous in the nucleus, now scattered into the coma where they can be lifted and read. The reading, like any careful dig, proceeds with brushes rather than shovels. A spectrum lies before the mind as a trench would lie before careful hands, every feature valuable mainly in its context, every absence meaningful only in relation to what surrounds it. Context arrives first as continuum. The broad glow of dust and warm grains sets the soil in which narrower lines live. Without that soil, the shards float unmoored, their curvature hard to judge. The instrument calibrates this ground gently, removing the uneven breathing of optics, subtracting the background's soft murmur, straightening the tilt left by response curves, so that the narrow signatures of molecules can sit where they truly belong. In this smoothing, the reader does not erase texture. The reader refuses to mistake tool marks for artifact. The patience feels archaeological, a decision to distinguish wind, ripple from footprint, plow, scratch from engraving. Individual lines present their edges as flake scars present theirs. Some are sharp, well-resolved with shoulders clean, suggesting transitions alone in their neighborhood. Others blend, like overlapping sherds pressed into the same soil, and only when lifted together does the curvature reveal which belongs to which vessel. Retrieval begins not with certainty but with a hypothesis, the way a refit begins with a hunch. This arc might meet that arc, this depth might belong to water, that narrow comb of features might be carbon monoxide, the strange shoulder might be dust pretending to speak in a molecular voice. The mind brings models the way an archaeologist brings typologies, and then listens to the site's right to disagree. The line spread function behaves like taphonomy, a slow, instrumented weathering that blunts edges and smears detail. Deconvolution answers like careful conservation, not to restore what never was, but to reveal what is likely beneath the varnish of optics. The process never insists. Overcleaning would invent an artifact that sunlight never made. Undercleaning would leave the story hidden. Between those cautions lies a kindness, the acceptance that some lines remain partial, some edges undecidable, and that undecidable still nourishes. Every feature bears a provenience, wavelength as coordinate, intensity as depth, uncertainty as the small tag tied to its rim. The archive holds these as field notes, exposure times, pointing, temperatures, instrument moods, so that later hands can stand again where the first stood. Around each feature, neighbors matter. A line meaningful. On a flat field becomes ambiguous when a nearby multiplete rises. A dip that looks authentic on a noisy night looks like chance once a quieter night arrives. The narrator lets this neighborhood effect set the tone. No shard alone creates a vessel. No line alone designs an atmosphere of gas. Ratios, those old. Companions resemble refits across features. One line married to another begins to suggest a curvature, rotational temperatures, column densities, optical depths. Here, patience widens into humility. Fluorescence can lift some transitions and lull others. Collisions in the inner coma can reassign energy like hands rearranging fragments on a table. Solar distance alters illumination the way burial depth alters color. The reader, aware of these post-depositional processes, writes in pencil. A temperature derived today is a temperature of the present breath, not of ancient formation. A column density is a snapshot of exhale, not a census of the pantry. The distinction calms the mind. Clarity grows where ambition loosens. Somewhere, in the working gentle priors enter like inherited maps. Other comets have taught typical ranges for certain ratios. Laboratory spectra have taught where bands tend to sit and how they flex with temperature. These priors do not command. They offer likeliest paths through a maze. The posterior, what the light presently allows, spreads like a softly lit landscape of maybe, hills where certain explanations rise probable, valleys where they sink. Bayesian kindness becomes an ethic. Let belief follow the evidence's contours, and allow the contours to remain wide when the light is faint. In that wide allowance, sleep finds a place to rest. Alternative readings coexist as parallel pots in a case. One fit says the shoulder near 3 microns is water's overtone riding dust. Another says organics contribute a low swell. A third suggests instrument memory might have traced a faint echo. None is dismissed. Each is weighed by simplicity, by residual quietness, by how well other parts of the spectrum hum in agreement. Model comparison becomes a kind of museum walk, standing back, returning, noticing which refit continues, to hold across rooms and which falters under a different light. The residuals themselves speak like ghost impressions in plaster. Where the story fails to sit against the observation, a negative casts the shape of what is missing. Line maps across the coma feel like site plans. Where water brightens along, a jet, Carbon dioxide may choose a corridor a few spaxels away. Dust thickens downwind of a slope warm by afternoon. Neutral sodium glows like faint street lamps along the sunward edge. The plan does not accuse. It observes. It honors the possibility that different pockets of the nucleus differ in history, some toughened by sinter, some sheltered by fresher frost, and that excavation by sunlight produces a mosaic rather than a uniform field. As in field work, the refusal to average too soon keeps meaning from dissolving. The plan remains legible precisely because it stays local. Noise wanders the site like footprints from another season. Cosmic rays score bright scratches. Detector quirks leave faint periodic shadings. Statistical chance places 2 high points, closer than they deserve to be. Instead of scolding noise, the reader puts small fences around it. Sigma cuts, coincidence checks, nights repeated, instruments changed. What survives the fences resembles a hearth's outline surviving centuries of trampling, a pattern that returns beyond expectation, that sits where heat would sit, that refuses to vanish when the sun turns and the field cools. The hearth image stays in mind without becoming an argument. It is enough that warmth seems plausible there. Composition evolves with time as layers do in a trench. Inbound spectra resemble the upper spit, loosened and ventilated. Perihelion brings a compacted richness. Outbound opens deeper deposits where slower volatiles keep their songs. Stratigraphy is temporal rather than vertical, but the lesson reads, the same. Assign meaning only after watching the sequence. The first surprising shard found in a fresh unit does not define the unit. Only after repeating, counting, and feeling its ratios within neighbors does it volunteer its rightful place. The cadence of nights replaces the depth of centimeters. Patience remains identical. Some features invite the word anomalous, which in a kind practice means only unfamiliar to current typologies. The reader treats anomalies as elders, with respect, with quiet questions, with a willingness to be taught. Many dissolve into the ordinary under the softer light of new calibration. Some remain, like vessels from a culture not yet mapped. The tone never hardens. An anomaly is a promise of a broader typology, not a warrant to declare invention. The mind holds it the way hands hold thin bone without breaking it for the sake of clarity. Across this slow archaeology of light, the traveler keeps its lack of opinion. It is both the broken vessel and the village floor. It is both the deposit and the weather that rearranges deposits. The instruments keep their discipline, the archives keep their memory, and understanding walks barefoot on dust that remembers stars. The result is not a verdict, but a dwelling, a way to live among fragments and feel whole, a way to notice that wholeness itself may be an illusion, comfort freely offered and gently refused. When the session ends, the spectrum returns to a quiet shelf. Lines remain lines. Ratios remain unclosed questions. In the mind, an image stays. A field at dusk, string grids laid, trowels resting, sherds bagged with numbers that will later become sentences. Nearby, the traveler fades a little farther along its unclosing path. Both scenes feel honest. Both accept that time has more to say. Both invite rest. Sunlight approaches like a hand warmed by a nearby fire and set down on frost. Nothing rushes. The traveler continues along its unclosing curve, and the slow geometry concentrates heat until the surface begins to listen differently. What was a faint exhale becomes a fuller breath. Pores that once kept their temper soften. Seams relearn. The old language of expansion. A shallow skin, darkened by dust that has lingered from earlier visits to light, drinks more energy than the pale beneath. The contrast writes weather into stone and ice measured in millimeters, then centimeters, then in a mood that belongs to the whole. Thermal inertia speaks in seconds and hours, in the depth to which day can sink before night asks for it back. Near perihelion, day deepens. Night fails to repossess all of it. Heat accumulates like memory in the crust. Layers that once slept through sunlight wake in sequence, each crossing its threshold with its own small grace. Water goes first where it is near and unashamed. Carbon dioxide answers from deeper rooms. Carbon monoxide keeps the longest quiet, then sends a thin report of chill vaults folded below. The sequence is not a rule, but a tendency, like the order, in which a landscape accepts spring. The traveler lets sunlight place small flags in its interior and does not argue. Jets, if they exist, begin as almost silences, localized places where a crack finds a reservoir, where a slope is favored by noon, where texture bends gas into a narrow exit. From these nearly invisible premises, a filament forms. Grains ride the filament. The coma near the base of the tail brightens with a humility that belies what careful models reveal. Gentle columns, fanning with rotation, turning what looks like fog into a clock. The period hides in brightness the way a note hides in a chant. Spin draws lace in the air and continues to pretend that nothing particular is happening. Rotation itself feels the light. Sublimation lifts momentum from the surface and trades it with the small body. Tiny torques set about their patient labor. The nucleus turns a little faster or a little slower. Its pole migrates by degrees. None of this is dramatic. Yet over weeks the change is noticeable to the kind of attention that returns to the same plot night after night. Light curve, peaks slip, dips separate, and the traveler's day lengthens or shortens the way a story lengthens or shortens in the telling. Equations accommodate the shift with courtesy. The sky prefers continuity. The curve remains unclosed. In the shallow depths, sintering starts to practice its craft. Grains fuse along contact points, not to become rock, but to become a firmer breath of rock. The crust that earlier allowed an easy draft begins to offer a measured resistance. Gas, seeking a path, learns patience. Pressure rises in small vaults that might never have been noticed had not the sun chosen this particular caress. Some vaults open with a soft crumble, others hold until a sudden persuasion arrives. A microfracture finds a cousin, and the two join hands and a jet brightens for an hour, then subsides as if embarrassed by its briefly public joy. Outbursts need not be violent to be real. They may resemble sighs. On the surface, mantles build where grains lifted cannot escape and fall back as a fine, insulating memory. Such mantles both starve and feed activity. They dim the heat beneath, postponing thresholds. They also gather dark and hasten warming in places where thinness and color conspire. Patches of dormancy appear beside patches of exuberance, seasonal not in the calendar sense, but in the sense of local time and circumstance. To call this terrain would be to ask for a map the coma cannot give. And yet terrain is what it feels like. Morning slopes and evening hollows, edges where one habit ends and another begins. Seasonal is not the wrong word after all. Even without a calendar, the orientation of spin to sun invites seasons of a sort, solstice and equinox happening on a world the size of a city block. A hemisphere leans into light and later away. Subsolar tracks migrate across knotted topography. Imagined but unseen. In these migrating belts, thresholds are crossed at different dates. The outbound leg may carry fresher water than the inbound if a pole only later turns to face the day. To instruments that listen in patience, the asymmetry reads like a climate. Gazetteer. The 6-week monsoon of one region, the late thaw of another. Non-gravitational accelerations join the conversation quietly. As the traveler exhales more strongly near the sun, the recoil adds a small nudge to the hyperbola, a minute remapping of where the object will be at a given hour. Models include this breath as a term that wears the sun's name and the traveler's. Temperament. Observers plot the slight residuals and watch them relax when the exhale is respected. The comfort in this lies not in control, but in acknowledgement. Movement honors the presence of light as more than warmth, also as push, also as decision. Erosion stays modest. A skin thins. A scarp retreats by grains. A vent's lip rounds. What breaks into survivable pieces. A sheet lifts and settles a little way off as a darker tile. A boulder shifts the length of its own shadow over a season of size. In the shorthand of production rates, these adjustments barely register. In the long math of returns that will never happen, they mean everything. They are the way a small world writes autobiography in relief and void, in a script that a distant eye cannot decode but can feel as texture. Down in the warmest centimeters, ice migrates. It leaves where the gradient is steep, condenses where the gradient softens, thickening a ceiling here, seeding a lens there. Pores tighten and relax, permeability edits itself. The result is a slow redecoration of pathways, a shifting of default routes for the next approach to fire that will never come. Perihelion is both event and author. The traveler exits not as it entered, not only because it has lost mass, but because the interior map has been redrawn in lines too fine for cameras and too real to ignore. Shear holds hands with cohesion. The crust's tensile strength, the small courage with which it resists change, competes with the gentler insistence of gas. When courage wins, a vent stays shut and warms to stubborn temperatures. When insistence wins, a crack opens and writes a plume. Neither side presses for victory. The system prefers compromise, and most of the time achieves it. Deep time has taught small bodies that survival is an average, not a triumph. Instruments keep up their companionable accounting. They watch water crest and fall. Carbon dioxide write its careful second curve. Carbon monoxide trail with a patience. That feels like wisdom. Dust production estimates breathe in and out, their slopes teaching more about texture than about origin. A brief outburst becomes a small star in a light curve. A quiet night becomes a line that pleases modelers. No single night feels decisive. The sequence acquires the authority that any chant acquires after many repetitions spoken softly. Outbound, the traveler's evening begins. Heat drains with grace. Sintered bridges hold a little, then release to colder equilibria. Jets fade into a general hush. Torques ease. Rotation steadies into whatever period the conversation with sunlight has assigned for this chapter. The coma thins to a memory, the tail to a suggestion, the nucleus to a syllable that the eye can barely pronounce. The sun steps back a pace. The curve keeps going, no curtain falls, nothing concludes. The patient changes wrought by proximity continue to relax, then freeze into place, a last page pressed under glass somewhere inside. The narrator sits with this slowness and lets breath align with it. Perihelion, that celebrated hinge, reveals itself as a practice rather than a moment. A long, kind negotiation between warmth and structure, between invitation and reply. Secrets do not so much unfreeze as choose how to be told. Some prefer a column of gas and a thin, bright vein in a map. Some prefer a torque measured months later. Some prefer the quiet truth that a world can be remade at the scale of grains, and still look like itself from far away. The thought holds and then delicately releases, like a hand drawing back from frost without leaving a mark. Between Mars and memory lies a line drawn by distance. On one end, Earth turns with its weather and its oceans of light. On the other, the red planet circles in a thinner hush, holding its own archives of ancient riverbeds and frost. In that long interval, a visitor moves, and the orbiters around. Mars, small sentinels living above the pale air, tilt their glass toward the pale coma. Two viewpoints appear, and with them a gentler depth. Parallax becomes a soft ruler. A position measured from Earth and again from Mars sketches a quiet triangle in space, and the triangle refines the path the traveler follows, as if two eyes bring a blur into focus without raising their voice. Geometry offers more than place. It offers mood. The angle between sun, traveler, and each observer differs, so the coma and tail present different faces. From one vantage, the dust glows with forward scattering, brightening the mind like breath on glass. From another, the same grains show their quieter sides. The ion tail, guided by fields, may align into a straight, cool filament for one observer while curving or thinning for the other. The difference is not contradiction. It is stereoscopy in slow time. The portrait gains contour, the way a relief gains depth when light crosses from a new direction. A Mars orbiter watching in ultraviolet sees hydrogen's wide whisper stretching, far beyond the visible coma. Lyman alpha spreading like an invisible dew, the sign of water broken apart by light and carried away. Another instrument listens in near-infrared for the small vowels of water and carbon dioxide, for carbon monoxide's narrow steps, for the dust continuum's patient swell. In radio, a faint echo speaks of electrons and fields. Each channel learns a slightly different language, and all of them translate into the same sentence. Sunlight encourages, ice replies, dust remembers. The words remain soft. The grammar remains patient. Light time separates the glances by minutes that feel like miles. Signals leave the traveler, cross the distances, and arrive out of sync at Earth and Mars. The small delay matters the way the pause in a heartbeat matters to a dancer's turn. Correcting for it, observers align their measurements until the triangle holds still enough for arithmetic. Out of that stillness comes a refinement in the non-gravitational nudge, a gentle vector that records the recoil of gas, the sum of many tiny exhalations. From Mars, that vector points a hair's breadth differently than from Earth. Together, they settle on a direction that feels more true, more proportionate to the jets that may draft and fade across the small world's skin. Mars itself contributes a kind of sympathy, a planet that keeps dried river deltas and lake beds like folded letters understands memory written in dust. Its thin air makes its sunsets long. Its seasons shuffle frost between poles and mid-latitudes. When its orbiters watch the travelers, frost breathe into space. They do so above a sphere where frost once wrote inland seas. No drama rises from this comparison. It is simply a way that two archives, one cometary, one planetary, share a table and exchange glances across a silent room. The baseline between planets turns out to be not only distance, but difference in phase angle, and with it, difference in what scattering of dust reveals. Forward, scattering from Mars's viewpoint may illuminate grain sizes that hide from Earth, while side scattering from Earth may favor other sizes or textures. Polarization curves, measured from both lines of sight, bend with complementary grace. Combined, they constrain porosity and roughness with more tenderness than either could alone, like two hands measuring a shell without pressing. The coma ceases to be a flat wash of brightness and becomes an atmosphere of grains with character. Rotation, too, becomes easier to hear when two ears listen. If jets pulse with the nucleus's spin, a pattern that looks ambiguous from one vantage can clarify from another. The same plume that seems to thicken and thin against a cluttered star field for Earth's eyes may display a simpler beat against the backdrop of Mars's leaner sky, or vice versa. Folding the two rhythms together reveals the period as a low, steady drum the traveler keeps, a drum that near the sun sometimes changes tempo by a fraction, the way breath changes with a hill both climbed and descended. Mars's orbit introduces seasons of opportunity. At certain geometries, the red planet lies sunward of Earth relative to the traveler, gifting a backlit view of dust that invites forward glow into honesty. At others, Mars stands to the side, offering profile. Sometimes, its orbit slows the apparent motion of the target, granting longer exposures without smearing. Sometimes it speeds it, teaching instruments to shorten their breath. The cadence does not ask for heroics. It asks for patience and for schedules elastic enough to let a small object pass through the quiet field of view more than once. Above Mars, there is no thick weather to ruffle starlight, and so the images keep edges others must reconstruct with computation. Yet the planet's own dust, the fine mineral breath that lifts in storms, can rise high enough to scatter sunlight into the line of sight, a pale intruder that gentle calibration escorts to the door. Even when such veils appear, orbiters find their windows, zenith angles that minimize glare, night-side glances that lean into emission rather than reflection, orbits that time their passes when the sky is most muted. The practice feels like listening to a room where a clock ticks. The ear learns to hear beneath it. Tomography begins to feel possible in a modest way. Coma maps from Earth and Mars, joined by timing and model, suggest the three-dimensional shape of emission, not as a sculpture on a pedestal, but as a cloud whose denser veins are more likely here than there. A jet that appears to rise sunward from one angle may reveal itself as a fan, leaning slightly out of plane when seen from the other. A plateau in a spectrum from one vantage softens into a slope from the other, hinting that dust and gas overlap differently along the two lines of sight. No single map prints the truth. The overlap increases tenderness toward the complexity, and tenderness is a kind of accuracy. Mars's vantage also brings the traveler into a different magnetic weather. The ion tail, responsive to fields that drift and twist, may kink or disconnect for one observer and appear smooth for the other, simply because the solar wind's moods differ along those paths. The comparison teaches caution and offers delight. A disconnection event seen by Mars instruments as a sudden thinning may register from Earth as only a mild change in brightness. Together, they write a better diary entry. Wind strong here, quieter there. Field lines reshaped, ions set free and then reattached to a new order. Across all this shared looking, a philosophy settles. Knowledge grows not by conquest, but by companionship. Two orbits, two phase angles, two small delays in light time, two kinds of stray light to subtract, none of it dramatic, all of it additive. The traveler remains uninterested in being decoded. It simply moves, exhales, and takes the geometry offered. The instruments remain uninterested in victory. They simply listen from where they are and fold their listening together with others, until the portrait feels proportionate to the quietness of the subject. Outbound, as the coma dims, Mars's contribution softens to a last, polite trace. The baselines lengthen, angles converge. Parallax shrinks until depth returns to idea rather than measurement. Yet the habit of binocular attention persists. Earth keeps its vigil. The red planet rotates under a thin dawn. In both skies, a faint. Tail continues its private arithmetic, the sum of forces that ask nothing of anyone. Between Mars and memory, the line holds. A measured space where cooperation replaces conclusion, where depth arises from difference without dispute, and where a small traveler leaves behind a lesson in how to look together. Jupiter waits off stage, not speaking, a bass note held beneath the melody of smaller things. It does not approach, it does not need to. Mass is a kind of patience. In the quiet arithmetic of the solar system, the giant's gravity folds space more deeply than others, tilting probabilities, curving itineraries that never touch its cloud tops. The traveler moves on, unclosing, yet the background bends minutely under that held note. The mind hears it as presence, not as event, a pressure on the air of the arrangement that makes the lighter instruments sound the way they do. Belts and zones, pale as parchment and warm as clay, turn in their perpetual antiphony across Jupiter's face. The long storm keeps its vigil like a thumbprint pressed gently into wind. None of this is the traveler's concern. yet everything about it shares a room with the traveler's path. A world so large is a conversation even in silence. Its hill sphere gathers families that seldom meet, shepherd moons and ring dust, small bodies that learn the grammar of staying near while the rest of the system names their distance in AU. The visitor from elsewhere slides past the neighborhood, but the neighborhood's gravity is already part of the overall sentence. In Nidennin, early times when the system was loud with leftover stones, Jupiter practiced an editing that endures, scatter of the inward bent, adoption of the fortunate, dismissal of the unfit across the boundary of escape. Many long ellipses that might have grazed the inner planets were lengthened into ejections instead. Many others were captured into reservoirs whose slow leaks now supply comets on long schedules. The giant does not remember any of this. The mathematics remembers for it. Tonight, that memory hums underneath the trajectory the traveler keeps, and that hum becomes a way to understand why the sky looks as it does. Mostly emptiness, but shaped emptiness. A shape can be felt even when it is not seen. The travelers. Hyperbola feels a tug so small it does not announce itself as deflection. Still, the models include a term for what the bass note adds to the orchestration, and residuals shrink when that term steps onto the page. This is how presence becomes legible, through the quiet improvement of fit, through the way uncertainty relaxes when an invisible hand is acknowledged. The effect does not swing candles, it merely settles dust. Jupiter's magnetosphere extends. Like a lantern's invisible glow, a wind-sculpted volume larger than anything the word planet seems prepared to host. Within it, charged particles corrotate with an insistence that speaks of a deep engine. A torus of sulfur and oxygen drifts where a moon's volcanoes feed the space around them. Auroral ovals thread the poles with braided light. On nights when geometry is kind, these distant weathers whisper across detectors pointed outward from the inner system, a background of motion that is not the traveler's motion. The distinction calms the mind. Many things move at once, not all of them move the visitor. If, by accident of timing, the traveler's faint ion tail glances through the far reach of the giant's magnetotail, the long, stretched sheath of field, pushed sunward and drawn nightward, it feels a different discipline of space. The ions respond as if to a new etiquette. Directions shift, speeds adjust in politesse with unseen lines. None of this breaks the open curve. It merely imprints a minor stanza in the larger poem of leaving, a stanza only instruments may notice, and only then as a suggestion. The comet proceeds. The tail lingers with a slightly revised posture, then forgets. Gravity at these distances plays a slower game. Resonances lie like isobars on a weather map, places where periods relate in small whole numbers and exchange energy in gentle increments. The traveler does not tarry long enough to be taught these rhythms, yet it passes through their pale corridors, and the idea itself comforts. Structure exists even where no object marks it. This is what a bass note does. It gives shape to what has not yet announced its edge. Some small fragments released from the traveler's surface, pebbles that chose to walk rather than rest, may cross the broad slope of the giant's influence, in their own time. A few might be repatterned, their future paths nudged into long, solitary orbits. Most will not be noticed by anyone, will simply join the general hush of interplanetary dust and be unmade by light. The thought enters and leaves without needing proof. It is enough to feel how a mass that is mostly elsewhere can still become part of what nearby becomes. Jupiter's moons drift in the imagination as a chorus, each voice distinct. One carries salt lines and under-ice seas, another carries fresh scars laid as if yesterday. A third carries soot-dark plains warmed by tides into long patience. The chorus does not sing tonight for the traveler, yet the harmonies remain in the air, a tonal center that keeps small objects honest about their speeds and inclinations. If a telescope turns briefly from the passing coma to the distant banded face, it does so not to change subjects but to honor continuity. One breath in light belongs to another. There is a rumor in celestial mechanics, soft and sober, that giants near a young star decide what survives. Some systems move their heaviest inward, scattering inner worlds and altering nurseries before they bake. Others leave their titans far out, as here, letting temperate zones go on with their quiet chemistry. The visitor from interstellar night may carry into this room the accent of such choices, a ratio learned in a different family of giants, a dust texture from a disk that did its editing another way. No claim is made. It is enough to hear that rumor and let it seat itself beside the traveler's spectrum without insisting they share a plate. If the traveler's path happens to bring it slightly nearer to the giant than to any other planet, a ledger records the smallest exchange. Time added here, angle subtracted there. Even a near miss far beyond moons can alter the date when the visitor will cross an arbitrary plane years from now. The archive is careful about such bookkeeping, not because a schedule needs defense, but because attention practiced at this scale learns humility. A kilogram of mass exacts tribute from kilometers of path. A day of a storm, no human will ever feel seeds decades of orbit in a motion no one will ever touch. Jupiter teaches an ethic of proportion. It demonstrates how to be influential without being close, how to shape without inscription, how to hold a room by listening. Earth learns here that presence can be a relief rather than a demand, that gravity can be hospitality instead of dominion. The traveler moves within that hospitality for a moment and then moves on, the way a pilgrim receives water at a doorway and thanks with a nod that does not break stride. The giant has long been called a shield, and also a slingshot, and also a gate. Each name is true and incomplete. It is a shield when it sweeps up bodies that would have gone inward, a slingshot when it hardens ellipses into open curves, a gate when it sets thresholds of entrance and departure through resonant halls. To the traveler, it is simply a background that makes some futures a fraction more likely than others. That fraction is not felt in bone. It is felt in graphs that smooth when the giant is remembered. Light from the sun crosses the giant and loses some clean simplicity to the planet's own shine. Reflected from cloud tops and rings, it washes the traveler's tail with a brightness so faint it does not compete with direct sunlight, yet it exists as part of the general weather, a pallor, tucked into the wings. Instruments do not measure it tonight. The mind includes it anyway, the way a listener hears the room's geometry inside a note and does not name it. Outbound, as distances unspool, the base note abides. Gravity does not weaken into irrelevance. It balances infinite reach with dwindling consequence. The traveler keeps its speed at infinity, keeps its angle, keeps the memory of a turning that belonged mostly to the sun. Jupiter remains a conditional in the sentence, a subordinate clause that shapes cadence without rewriting meaning. The narration stays in third person because everything here does. Jupiter listens, the traveler proceeds, the sky holds. Late in the imagining, another thought sits down with the rest. A large presence edits the archive not only by what it captures or deflects, but by what it inspires others to watch. Telescopes turn because a giant has a way of inviting attention to scale. That attention outlives the event. It returns to the small visitor with a gentler hand, to listen for changes in light curve that may owe a hair's breadth to a season of jets, a microtorque of sunlight, a nod in passing to a planet that never looked back. The practice becomes the result. The bass note trains the ear to hear. The scene holds for a moment longer, banded world turning beyond the line of sight, small visitor dwindling into the general dark. Nothing collides, nothing proclaims. Influence remains as a temperament, not a headline. Breathing slows to the same measure as the outer planets, long, even, unhurried. Jupiter is there. The traveler is here, then farther. The space between keeps its tender architecture, held together by forces that do not require noise. The bass note fades only in the sense that ears grow accustomed to it. It is still being played. Forgetting on a planet has edges, and they are not sharp. They are braided margins where time learns to edit itself. Valleys open, mountains kneel into plains, seas lift and retreat, and in that choreography the archive rewrites its own first lines with every stanza. A question sits with this: what does a world preserve, and what does it let go? Not out of malice, but out of the ordinary patience of wind and water and heat. The traveler from elsewhere carries its memories into vacuum, where nothing but light abrades. Earth keeps its memories in weather, where everything abrades, and that difference becomes a mood. Rivers think with slopes. They cut where gravity suggests, lay down where momentum yields, and in their long sentences are commas where floods pause to deposit and then continue carving. A layer appears that reads quiet, then another that reads sudden, then another that reads merely after. Within such layers, delicate structures, cells' walls, shells' lacework, the gritty syntax of towns, can survive for a chapter, then dissolve into particles, then into elements, then into trace. The narrator lets that dissolving sit gently, like bread going back to flour, flour to field. Nothing vanishes as much as it translates. He lets wind have its turn. It whispers first, then instructs, then persuades. Dunes learn to migrate, rain shadows rewrite their maps. Dust leaves continents for ocean and returns by different routes. The slow chisel of frost takes hold in cracks by night and relaxes by day. A tide in stone measured not in meters but in microns and patience. Cliffs recede without drama. The word ruin pretends to belong to houses, but it belongs as well to mountains. Much older rooms where gravity keeps clearing furniture. Underfoot, the temperature of forgetting rises. Burial turns the wet language of mud to the firmer. Tongue of shale translates plant to coal, shells to limestone and then to marble when deeper heat asks them to loosen their lattice and retell their story in more crystalline sentences. Sand becomes sandstone, then quartzite. Clay becomes slate, then phyllite, then schist, then the long quiet of gneiss. Each step reduces some specificity and increases endurance. Patterns survive at the cost of names. A line of human detail would have to enter the press of metamorphism as ink and leave as texture, and texture seldom carries authorship. At the boundaries where plates meet, the book binding changes again. Ocean floor, written with the slow type of basalt and a quicker script of sediment and life, glides toward trenches and sinks. There, rock learns fluid verbs, elements unlearn associations, reset their acquaintances, and climb again as arc volcanoes that speak an altered language of fire. The old pages feed new letters. The ocean opens elsewhere and writes fresh basalt with a confident hand, while the recycled words rise as mountains that will, in their time, subject themselves to wind's edits. The cycle does not ask whether any paragraph was precious. It asks whether motion continues. Stillness is not an absence in this archive. It is a particular room. In salt flats where evaporation outweighs supply, layers settle as quiet calendars of drought and flood. In anoxic basins at depth, where oxygen fails to arrive, fine particles lie undisturbed and preserve details that feel like kindness. A fish's soft part, a leaf's thin vein, a microbe's coins of mineral. Yet even here, patience does not guarantee persistence beyond a handful of geologic moods. A basin fills, the chemistry shifts, the slab tilts, a river wakes a chisel, and the diary returns to its elements. The forgiveness of erasure becomes part of the elegance. Unconformities make pages disappear without tearing them. A surface lies open to air and is dressed by weather. Later, a sea returns and writes a new layer over an older one with a missing. A middle. The gap says without accusation, time lived here, and we have only its threshold and its conclusion. Between them, an interval of unknown length has been turned into slope and soil, into fragments that traveled and were used elsewhere. The planet practices omission as a lucid art. Against that art, any ephemeral making must either lodge in sheltered corners or accept that it will be redistributed into the language of minerals and water. In caves, dripstone grows patience by increments, counting water's surplus as rings count spring. In glaciers, bubbles keep small atmospheres, turning air to archive with pressure and cold. In deserts, varnish coats stones with micron-thin films that hold metal and carbon as rumor. These collections are generous and precise, yet they remain local dialects. A global sentence must be stitched across many, stitching phrase with distance. Maps help, but maps are another kind of forgetting, choosing what to keep large and what to let small. Life itself edits. Microbes metabolize what they can reach. Fungi shuttle nutrients across wood and soil. Roots pry. Even after burial, the biochemistry of decay rearranges complexity into smaller vocabularies that geology then further condenses. If a layer once held synthetics, unlike those made by process alone, time would test their confidence. Some chains would persist, many would fragment. A handful might reach the future as signatures and outline, a contour of abundance more than a name. The planet does not hoard, it recirculates. Fire writes quickly and erases quickly. It volatilizes organics, glazes sand into glass where lightning or heat is sudden enough and seeds the air with spheres of melted dust that memory could mistake for other blazes. Volcanic fire writes similar marks with a different grammar. The two dialects mingle in the sky's soot and return together to ground as a script that requires context to distinguish authors. The more one learns to read one, the more fluently one hears the other, and the more gently one admits that proofs rarely arrive with labels. A thought returns to the traveler. Its forgetting is an architecture of exposure. Sunlight, wind of charged particles, the brief insistence of heat near. Perihelion, the slow garden shears of radiation across long distances. What it loses outward. What it keeps in cold. Earth's forgetting is an architecture of concealment and rearrangement. What it often loses downward. What it keeps by translation. The two modes produce different archives and different silences. Holding them side by side enlarges the comfort that uncertainty gives. Faults themselves, those clear lines where rock reassumes motion, become consuming editors. They grind, they polish, they smear. At depth, they lubricate with minerals crystallized, from water squeezed out of rock. At the surface, they tilt layers and make fresh faces for weather to work upon. A city placed across such a line would learn the verb rearrange too intimately. Its relics, redistributed, would settle as cobbles and sand in a new river's bed. Later, someone might quarry the compressed result and build again elsewhere. Authorship would wander with the materials. Studiousness would be required to recognize the migration. In coring a continent, the drill lifts not simply rock, but decision. Every meter that comes to light represents millions lost to sea and uplift and metamorphosis, not in tragedy, but in the ordinariness by which a living world stays alive. The cores read as if someone had circled some days on a calendar and left the rest to weather's kind handwriting. The blank spaces are not empty. They are occupied by process. It becomes enough to hold a segment and feel the weight of what is not there without wanting it back. Islands sink under their own cooled weight and rise again on plumes of surprising heat. Oceans close, stitch continents together, and open again, like a patient breathing. Ice cuts wide valleys and leaves them as green tongues. Salt creeps and domes. On coasts, the line between sea and land walks inland and out as if remembering different homes, writing strand lines in staircases a careful eye can climb. No one chapter holds still long enough to become a monument beyond weather. Monument here is the flow itself. The lesson pulls gentle. A planet's talent for forgetting is also its talent for renewal. Erosion and subduction and recrystallization are not destructions so much as reorganizations that keep gradients driving, cycles turning, climates modulating. If an earlier flourish of making once occurred, its legibility now would be constrained by these generosities. Traces would be asked to persist within systems designed to translate. Some would pass the test by accident. Most would be paraphrased into clay and carbonates, into stray alloys diluted to background, into isotopic tilts that rhyme with natural episodes and must be read with care. He lets the mind rest in the phrase fault lines of forgetting, hearing both the fracture and the grace in it. Fault lines may be places of hazard for structures, but they are also the lines along which continents have learned dance steps, exchanging partners, changing tempo, scattering and joining. Forgetting here is not neglect. It is choreography. Memory does not vanish. It becomes movement. The archive stands not as a shelf of volumes, but as a river of pages, written on water and rock that keep the script by changing the letters. Night leans in around this thought. The traveler continues its outward recollection of warmth. Earth continues its inward circulation of stone. The air in the room cools a little. No verdict arrives. The sense persists that, even with the most delicate instruments and the gentlest, listening, the story of a vanished chapter would be told as pressure, as tilt, as a slight excess in a clay, as the absence of what might have been, as a whisper among whispers. The whisper is enough to keep company with sleep. The ocean opens like a library with the lights kept low. Shelves drift downward as particles, thin pages of dust and plankton that settle into quiet stacks. Carbon moves through these rooms with different postures, some carried in shells that fall as chalk snow, some bound in soft bodies that disassemble into whispers, some charred into soot that resists water's eager editing. The sea accepts all of it. What is fragile dissolves, what is stubborn persists, and between the two lives a ledger of great patience where climate writes a chant of rises and fallings, and life revises each line with its own small pen. Far above the abyss, sunlight measures its reach. In that illuminated skin, algae scribble with CO2 and light, their pigments breathing an alphabet of greens and browns. Tiny architects build houses of carbonate, their chambers spun like thought into spirals and boxes, then released to gravity's soft courts when living ends. The rain of this labor becomes a snowfall of calcium and memory, drifting through dimness where hungry mouths slow, drifting further where the cold accepts and the oxygen thins its say. Some shells dissolve before they reach the floor, their aragonite too sensitive for the water's mood. Others arrive intact and stack like the meekest of monuments. Within each fragment lies a small clock and a small compass. Ratios of carbon isotopes tilt with the breath of biology. Ratios of oxygen remember the temperature of the water in which a creature calcified thought into stone. A later hand reads those tilts as a story told with humility. Here, cooler seasons. There, warmer. Here, a shift in currents that carried different salt and light. There, a bloom of plankton that leaned the ledger briskly toward the living. No page tells origin loudly. Each repeats a theme the way waves repeat their edges. Not identical, but insistently familial. The abyss itself keeps a slower discipline. Clays from continents and dust from deserts pause in water, sip ions and reorganize into flakes so thin they seem like the patience of time made visible. They descend with a courtesy that admits interruptions. Volcanic ash, river floods, faint sifts of meteoritic smoke, and then continue. Organic traces hide between their plates. The clay remembers without boasting, a pale substrate where old carbon can find a bed. The bed resists oxygen when oxygen sleeps. The result is neither burial nor display, but a long, dim rehearsal of keeping. Against these quiet archives, a thought enters with equal quiet. If a brief industrial pulse once moved across a planet's air, how would the ocean translate it? Carbon exhaled from stone arrives light in its isotopes. The sea drinks some of it and records that lightness in shells and in dissolved inorganic equilibria that later become limestone and chalk. Soot rises and falls, some sinking with marine snow, some floating longer, blackening the skins of bubbles, then sinking as skin. Halogens, metals, unfamiliar carbon chains, each follows the pathways available, absorbing onto clays, pairing with sulfides in anoxic rooms, or drifting longer until diluted into background. The archive refuses theater. It composes a hint. Walking further along this imagining, an observer sees how signals blur into kinships. Natural fires also seed soot. Volcanism also distributes metals. Oxygen-starved intervals also darken pages and tilt ratios. The ocean's grammar admits many authors for similar sentences. To hear an unusual voice inside the choir, one attends to ensemble rather than solo. Alignments of features that arrive together more often than chance, concentrations that hold across basins, timing that rhymes with nothing but human weather. Even then, sleep insists on gentleness. Coincidence remains possible, and nature's repertoire is larger than any single study. Shells differ by species not only in shape, but in how they bind the surrounding water's story. Some foraminifera hoist themselves near the surface and write the atmosphere into calcium almost directly. Others dwell deep and write currents instead. Coccoliths, with their overlapping plates, record a blend of surface intimacy and export efficiency. A balance between buoyancy and surrender. Diatoms make glassy boxes that shatter into glitter and still carry a fraction of the news. Together, their remains form a chorus of overlapping registers. The analyst learns to separate the voices by timbre, by size, by habit, by where in the water column a life preferred to say its name. Polymer ghosts, if they arrive, modify the sediment's comfort in subtle ways. Some fragments soften into waxes. Others gather onto sticky gels formed by the sea's own exudates. A few sink with fecal pellets wrapped in the economy of copepods. Over time, the ghosts accept translation. Chains shorten, halogens slip, additives wander, and only a contour persists. Hydrophobicity here, a stubborn chain length there, a fingerprint loud enough to suggest intentionality, yet quiet enough to be mistaken for chance. The narrator lets the ambiguity rest. The sea, generous and impartial, levels the boastfulness of invention into habit. Deep basins where oxygen rarely visits preserve what other rooms cannot. There, organic carbon accumulates to percentages that would rot elsewhere. There, enzymes take longer to find purchase. There, arsenic and molybdenum tilt their curves when sulfur captures them into mineral marriages. If a strange alloy drifts down, it tarnishes, then stabilizes. If a synthetic molecule settles, it sits intact far, longer than weather at the surface would allow. Yet even anoxic patience has seasons. A shift in currents lifts the blanket, air trails a finger through water, and preservation relaxes back toward the general rate. Archiving is a climate, not a vault. Isotopes speak softly here as they do in Comae, though their alphabets differ. In shells, carbon's lightness suggests an air newly revised by ancient stores. In soot, radiocarbon's absence tells of carbon without recent sunlight. In carbonates, boron leans with acidity, drawing a sketch of ocean pH that moves with the breath of the whole planet. None of these alone writes a signature that cannot be mistaken for nature's other moods. Together, they form a suite that, in certain arrangements, reads like a deliberate chord. Even then, the ocean resists dramatization. It offers probabilities that cradle rather than puncture. The floor learns to count very slowly. Sedimentation rates in abyssal plains may deliver a millimeter a millennium, sometimes less, sometimes more. A city, translated to mud, becomes a tenth of a page scattered across a shelf that will take an epoch to compile. Yet the quiet is not emptiness, it is fullness done gently. A volcanic glass shard settles among coccoliths. A comet's dust fleck lies beside a burned crumb from a forest. A bead of industrial origin, if one exists, joins them without complaint. Later, pressure knits these ingredients together and presses them into rock that no longer recalls which particle came from which story. In this dim, thorough patience a resonance with the traveler's carbon appears. Cometary organics, plain and stubborn, carry rings and chains that withstand cold and radiation. They arrive in spectra as soft humps and dim bands. They leave in tails as seeds and soot. Oceanic carbon, just as patient in another climate, perseveres. Through burial, diagenesis, gentle metamorphosis, each step paraphrasing without erasing all at once. Both are catalogues of what remains when environments insist on their temperaments. Both remind that endurance has more to do with compatibility than with intent. A prayer of carbon, if one can call it that, sounds like this. Let structure find rooms that do not demand its dissolution. Let bonds that wish to remain find circumstances that agree. Let archives exist that do not fetishize clarity, and let readers accept suggestion as a virtue. In the ocean, the prayer is rarely denied. In the traveler's coma, it is answered by distance and light. The two prayers echo one another across scales and temperatures, each whispering that the fate of complexity is to be edited, not erased, translated, not annihilated. Outward, the traveler lessens its breath. Lower, the ocean continues its slow confessional. Storms pass and take nothing from abyssal patience. A core rises someday into a lab's cold light and exposes a cinnamon-colored column banded with chalk, and clay, ash, and soot, a few baffling streaks, a few elegant normals. The reader strokes the surface with eyes and instruments, hears temperature and carbon and dust and chance, and writes a sentence that keeps question marks like lanterns at the end. The ocean does not mind. The abyss does not speed up or slow down. It reads the same chant of settling, and between the syllables a thin, gentle possibility remains that any brief technology would have been absorbed and diffused into music, not silence. The section grows quiet. The floor of the world settles a little more under the weight of small snow. Comet and core, tail and clay all continue their unhurried practice of keeping what they can. The mind accepts that this is enough, a shared discipline of patience, a shared preference for suggestion. The prayer concludes without concluding, as is its habit. Carbon keeps its vigil in rooms above and rooms below, and the lights of the library remain low. Seeds drift without intention. Chemistry does not plan. It repeats. Yet repetition under sunlight begins to feel like offering. In The Travelers, coma, small families of carbon and oxygen and nitrogen step into light and alter themselves by it, adding a bond here, losing one there, building rings that hold their shapes like quiet hands. Some fragments resemble the alphabets used by life on Earth. Others belong to a more general script, patient chains and simple acids that prefer no author. The question arrives gently and refuses boldness. Are these voyagers? Recipes awaiting? Kitchens, or only echoes of matter going about its slow, indifferent craft? He lets the word seed loosen. A seed may be a cell, but it may also be a recipe, a bias, a set of ways atoms like to meet when given particular rooms and times. Ice on dust in a cold nursery forms a laboratory with rules. Ultraviolet light splits small molecules, radicals, recombine on surfaces. Temperature ebbs and flows, letting mobility begin and then arrest. Over long winters, simple precursors grow more intricate. Laboratory analogs suggest as much, though lab time flattens centuries into hours and light into lamps. The traveler's grains hold older experiments, warmed enough near a star to release, their notes into spectra, yet cold enough for many notes to remain. He imagines a flake of ice speckled with carbon-rich dust, drifting between suns for 1,000,000 years. Radiation nicks and rearranges bonds. Secondary electrons buzz like gnats and then fade. The flake filters the fury so that the interior learns to persist. Porosity becomes shelter. A few microns of ice and minerals serve as shade against ultraviolet, as cushion against sudden heat. The flake is not a ship. It is a climate that allows certain structures to keep appointments with later worlds. When a comet liberates such grains, the sky receives not a manifesto but a weather report. These patterns endure. Some motifs recur because physics enjoys them. Rings stacked like coins, chains with alternating double bonds, small acids and nitriles, neutral sugars cousins that prefer to stay shy, small amides that find surfaces hospitable. Each appears not as intention but as habit. Such habits accumulate. On a rocky shore or in a pore of basalt warmed by water, habits become options. Options are not life, yet they shorten the path between disorder and the kind of orderable complexity that later calls itself living. The traveler's exhale, scaled up to a rain across a young planet, reads like help not aimed at anyone. He lets water enter the room. On Earth, water dissolves, transports, concentrates, and catalyzes. It also hydrolyzes and erases. In deep fissures warmed by rock, in pools that evaporate and refill, on clays and metal sulfides and iron-nickel. Grains, reactions select pathways the way rivers select channels. If cometary or interstellar molecules arrive, they add to local ingredients, sometimes overlapping perfectly, sometimes offering a shortcut, sometimes only standing by as guests. None of this requires a plan. It requires opportunity. Worlds provide it intermittently. Seeds, if the term must be used, are invitations rather than inevitabilities. In this imagining, he considers endurance. Cells fail quickly in vacuum, spores endure longer, dried consortia flirt with time and pressure in brief experiments that say little about interstellar spans. Molecules ignore the question. They neither live nor die. They break and remake, equilibrium wandering until distance and shielding define a slow, steady state. In ice, many persist to surprise. In unshielded dust, many edit themselves toward simplicity and then stop. The traveler's coma holds both fates in miniature. Outbound, sunlight gentles. Inbound, it insists. Through both, certain bonds keep their patience. If a fragment descends into an atmosphere, its future depends on speed, angle, size, and luck. Large rocks flare and reform as spheres of glass. Small grains decelerate softly and arrive cool, like day-old snow. Some carry volatile vestiges, others bring only mineral and a faint perfume of carbon. In rain and river and tide, these guests lose their separate names and become stock in the global pot, indistinguishable from local broth except by very careful ears. A planet that already experiments with chemistry scarcely notices the donation. A planet not yet experimenting may, in time, find the contribution useful. Neither case implies intent. Gravity remains the only invitation mailed. He thinks of recipes, and kitchens and the way a room's materials decide what can be cooked. Without phosphate in solution, some menus remain theoretical. Without sources of redox disequilibrium, Others lack energy. Without wet-dry cycles or mineral templates or deep vesicle walls, scaffolds of complexity fail to persist long enough for selection to begin. The traveler does not supply these rooms. It offers ingredients and biases. Seeds that drift forever must meet soils that pause long enough to let their tendencies speak. Many soils refuse. A few listen. Listening is geology's decision, not the seed's. Surface photochemistry writes one chapter. Hydrothermal chemistry writes another. Impact chemistry writes a loud, staccato stanza that cools quickly into softer work. In each room, comet-borne motifs may be remixed, nitriles hydrolyzed to acids, and amides. Carbonyls condense on warm minerals. Simple sugars isomerize and caramelize. Small heterocycles attempt rings that later life will prefer or will replace with others. The notion of prebiotic remains a retroactive complement given by one successful lineage to the chemistry that preceded it. Other lineages might have minted other complements in other languages, or none at all. Across time, the galaxy behaves like a patient exchange. Stars form, live, and die, stirring the medium with shocks and dust, peppering it with metals that widen chemistry's alphabet. Disks condense around new suns. Comets and planetesimals inherit this alphabet with local accents. Some are cast outward to travel the rooms between stars. A few cross the paths of stranger systems and write faint chalk on their skies. The traveler recapitulates this gentle commerce. It enters as guest and leaves as guest, bringing nothing priceless, taking nothing irreplaceable, yet participating in a circulation whose slowness is indistinguishable from generosity. He allows another possibility to sit, neither favored nor banished, that certain complex patterns might, under extravagantly fortunate conditions, protect information long enough to count as memory. Not genomic memory, not yet, but a propensity to catalyze their own making or to guide reactions along particular roads. Autocatalysis hovers here like a rumor told by both laboratory and model. Compartmentalization hovers nearby, whispering that boundaries help stories hold together. The traveler does not write such structures into being. It sometimes delivers components that, once inside a boundary, speed decisions. If none of this occurs, the molecules remain what they already are: elegant, durable, uncommitted. The phrase "recipes for worlds" turns softer. A recipe is not a world. It is a set of odds made friendlier. In a kitchen without heat, the recipe waits. On a planet without free water, it waits. In a region where tides fail to alternate, it waits. The traveler's dust, arriving in pinches, does not shorten the waiting. It broadens the menu. Some worlds never cook. Some worlds burn and start again. Some find simmer. Life, when it appears, borrows from whatever pantry sits closest to hand and then alters the shelves to suit its own hunger. Later, it may look back and call certain items essential, though other menus might have sufficed. He returns to the coma, where a small hump in a spectrum says only that rings exist, that chains exist, that a grammar of carbon is at ease in harsh light. The humility of that signal comforts. There is no obligation hidden inside it. The molecules here neither promise nor refuse. They travel as pilgrims that do not know pilgrimage. They settle as silt on worlds that may or may not notice. If a seed must be invoked, it is a seed that does not mind never sprouting. Outbound, the visitor's breath thins. The laboratory closes moment by moment, leaving products distributed through space like faint punctuation. Somewhere, a world receives a comma. Somewhere else, a period. Elsewhere, only a pause. Chemistry resumes its patient work in darkness as if nothing had happened, which in a way is true. The narrator allows the question to remain open on the table like a book left face down. The seeds drift. The recipes persist. The echoes continue. Whether any of it becomes a voice is a decision worlds make in their private kitchens, under lights and gravities indifferent to applause. A possibility arrives like mist, not a proclamation, but a coolness, in the air. A line on a spectrum sits where habit says there should be none, or it rises with a sharpness out of proportion to the others, or it refuses to vary with sunlight the way its neighbors do. The mind, trained by patience, does not leap. It leans. There is a word waiting at the edge, technosignature, but it remains outside the room for now, hat in hand. Inside, instruments. Breathe. Calibration files open like drawers. Models take their places at the table. Doubt acts as host and pours water for everyone. A gentle method attends first to the instrument. Optics have memories, and detectors hum with preferences. A faint fringing can braid false cadence into a continuum. Electronic ghosts can place reflections of honest lines a polite distance away. The microshutters decide which light may enter and sometimes leave their own faint punctuation. Gratings add their soft fingerprint. Thermal baselines drift and are later pinned. The anomaly sits patiently while these habits are acknowledged. If it remains after kindness is shown to every quirk, it earns a second chair. Next comes the sky. That is not the traveler. Sunlight arrives with a forest of Fraunhofer lines that reflection can mimic if dust chooses the right angles. Zodiacal light carries its pale household of features. Background sources wander into slits and step out again with uninvited signatures. A long, faint tail may overlap a star and borrow its vowels. The anomaly waits while catalogs are consulted, while apertures are rotated, while neighborhoods are shifted a little to the left and the right. If it follows the coma rather than the field, the conversation continues. Then the physics of the coma makes its case. Gas excited by sunlight speaks with a particular grammar. Vibrational ladders, rotational rungs, fluorescence that brightens where geometry favors pumping and fades elsewhere. A line that refuses this grammar, that does not scale with distance. From the sun, or with the local density traced by familiar companions, becomes more interesting and more suspect at once. Perhaps it belongs to a species rarely abundant in comets. Perhaps it belongs to dust, fluorescing in an unfamiliar way. Perhaps it belongs to nothing but statistics. Repetition is invited into the room. Second nights, third nights, other instruments, other phase angles. The anomaly, if real, learns to endure. Whispers of the improbable have names. Some are halocarbons, designed on Earth to be patient and invisible to weather, spectral snowflakes whose fingerprints sit in quiet corners of the infrared. Others are sulfur-fluorine compounds that resist chemistry with a serene obstinacy. Still others are odd, long-lived gases that biology seldom shapes and geology seldom favors. If such lines should rise above coma and continuum, the mind would not sigh proof. It would ask four older questions. Does the line stand alone or arrive in a family as the molecule's physics demands? Does it appear across instruments and epochs? Does it track the coma rather than the sky? Does it scale with exhale the way emission should? Anything less invites a kinder conclusion, analog, artifact, or chance. Not every technosignature would be gaseous. Surfaces sometimes shine with an order that stone alone does not prefer. Specular glints betray planes. Polarized reflections lean differently than dust. Yet a small nucleus is rubble and frost, and geometry rarely flat. A glint would need to repeat and rotate with the nucleus. Polarization would need to exceed what porous grains offer. Otherwise, unusual becomes merely uncommon, a brightness tightened by phase and angle, not by craft. The eye keeps humility. The curve of light keeps its right to be sufficient unto itself. Behavior can masquerade as intent. An outgassing that changes the traveler's turning might be read as thrust when it is only the arithmetic of jets. A periodic, Brighten and fade might be read as message when it is only rotation with patchy vents. A sudden outburst might resemble exhaust when it is only a fracture opening like a yawn. The remedy remains cadence and context. Line maps that show jets where jets are plausible. Non-gravitational nudges that match production estimates. Changes. Inbound that repeat outbound with the difference that seasons allow. If, after all of that patience, a rhythm remains that refuses nature's plausible tunes, the word waiting at the edge may be invited to sit closer, not to speak, only to listen, with the rest. In this room of possibilities, the Silurian thought returns, not as claim, but as proportion. On Earth, a past industry, if such a thing ever exists, keeps few loud souvenirs and many small tilts, ratios leaning softly, alloys weathered to aftertastes, a handful of stubborn molecules that decades later read as rumor. The Cometary Archive suggests something similar, that endurance favors the modest, the well-mixed, the easily confused. If a sign of craft were to ride a visitor's exhale, it would likely be small and statistical, indistinct from certain kinds of unusual chemistry. The ethics of reading asks restraint that matches the faintness of the letters. Restraint is not refusal. It is a posture that invites control experiments into every contemplation. A line that tempts imagination is tested by defocusing, by changing slits, by moving to blank sky and back. It is weighed against laboratory spectra at temperatures and pressures appropriate to the coma. It is modeled under different solar distances and phase angles. It is compared with other comets' histories. Only when these gentlenesses fail to unsettle it does curiosity become bolder, still without crossing into declaration. Claims walk more slowly than hunches. In this house, they walk barefoot. The archive helps by remembering uncertainty. Each measurement carries errors that are not apologies, but dimensions. When an anomaly survives within those dimensions, it earns a name, candidate. Candidates are generous. They promise further nights, not headlines. Some end as calibration notes, in later handbooks. Some become footnotes in papers that show how dust fakes a molecule's footstep. A very few remain as steady companions to model curves that could be simpler, but are not. The presence of such survivors does not unsettle the quiet. It enriches it, the way a persistent question enriches a walk. Another kind of sign sits outside spectra. They are patterns in timing and in place, a line that maps to a narrow vein within the coma, that pivots with the nucleus, that brightens at consistent longitudes not tied to geometry, suggests a local source. If its kinetics defy ordinary sublimation, if it rises when shade should, cool it, or stays when heat should lift it away, then attention grows sharper, still kind. Perhaps a center holds a trick. Perhaps a pocket vents through a thermal diode. Perhaps an ice of uncommon chemistry sits near a dark tile. The list of natures is long, and it is honest work to walk it before invoking craft. He lets radio whisper at the threshold. Narrow band signals are famous candidates in other rooms of the sky. Here, the laboratory is a coma of expanding gas. Any narrowness would need to survive Doppler spread and turbulence. Any coherence would need to endure stones uncoordinated. Breathing. That makes such signs unlikely, not impossible. The appropriate response is the same as always. Try to repeat. Try to triangulate. Try to correlate with other features. Fail cheerfully. Try again when geometry is different. Doubt in these rooms is the worker that keeps the lights on. Across all of it drifts a tender philosophy. Possibility deserves hospitality, and hospitality requires boundaries. To say perhaps is to open a window. To say therefore is to close a door. The traveler, breathing through ice into light, offers abundant natural stories that do not need help to be beautiful. A techno-signature, if it exists, need not be loud to be real, yet it must be more legible than the inventions of instrument and chance. The threshold between those is not a line, but a meadow. The practice is to walk the meadow slowly, noticing grasses, respecting mirages, and choosing campsites only where ground is firm. Outbound, the anomaly, if it was ever there, either persists or softens into the ordinary. Many will soften. Many already have. A few will keep company with the record, returning across instruments and nights as a small, immovable syllable. Even then, the narration remains gentle. The word at the edge is allowed in, still quiet, still cautious, not as verdict, but as guest among other guests. Sleep likes this decorum. Curiosity remains awake where certainty might have shut its eyes too soon. The spectrum, long after the visit, will sit on a shelf where lines no longer glow and only numbers remember. Students will read it as one reads a fossil ripple in stone. This was motion. This was wind. This was water. This may have been something more, but the stone is sufficient. The traveler carries no obligation to prove or disprove. It carries only light made articulate by ice. The room cools a degree. The thought that a sign could appear remains tender, neither embraced nor exiled. The sky keeps breathing. Doubt keeps watch like a kind night attendant, unafraid of what morning may or may not show. A grain becomes a compass when patience looks closely enough. Not a needle that fixes direction, but a leaning in proportions. Magnesium to iron within. Olivine, calcium to aluminum inside stubborn clasts. Crystalline order set against quenched glass. Each balance prefers a certain neighborhood of temperature and pressure within a young disk. The traveler releases such grains into light. Their scattering keeps those preferences intact, quiet as handwriting. The thought remains gentle. Mineral. Ratios form small maps, not of streets but of climates, sketches of where warmth once stood, where shade endured, where frost lines divided one habit from another. He lets the condensation sequence widen like a shore. Closest to a newborn sun, the hottest vapors settle first into calcium and aluminum-rich fragments that tolerate fever. Farther out, silicates condense the way fog becomes sand. Farther still, water drafts architecture from vapor. Beyond that, carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide accept the distances of deep winter. A body assembled across these zones inherits their moods. When it later loosens dust in a foreign sky, those moods return as brightness and color, as polarization and faint. Features, as if the grain were a folded atlas that opens in light. Magnesium and iron keep a quiet ledger. In olivine and pyroxene they trade places according to heat and oxygen's patience. Crystals grown near warmth carry more magnesium. Those content with cooler rooms carry more iron. The blend returns in the coma as a subtle reddening or a change. In polarization with angle, chemistry speaking as tint and texture together. From so far away the tints remain hints, yet hints gain weight when they agree across nights and instruments. The map stays low resolution, like a coastline sketched from a deck at dusk, but it still points, closer to the fire, or farther, more, oxidizing or more reducing, more time to anneal or less. Some grains come older than any disk. Tiny carriers, silicon carbide, graphite, certain oxides, wear isotopic accents from dying stars and supernovae. Meteorites on Earth keep a few such presolar guests that evade the homogenizing ambition of nebular mixing. If the traveler bears comparable elders, their presence would not name a particular nursery so much as the galaxy's longer weather, a parliament of ancestries meeting inside a small breath. The map expands beyond one system, reminding that every planetesimal is partly mosaic, that any visitor may carry echoes of winds it never felt and fires it never saw. Crystallinity practices cartography of its own. In some comi, silicate resonances. At long wavelengths rise cleanly, announcing ordered lattices. In others, the features flatten into the sigh of glass. Models suggest crystals can be born near the hot inner disk and then be carried outward by winds and turbulence, frozen into bodies far from the flame. The crystalline fraction becomes an arrow implying travel rather than address, a record of motion inside a nursery that never stood still. The traveler's dust, read this way, is not merely composition but itinerary, a path from furnace to shade, then outward into winter, and at last into the present sky. Maps hide in volatiles as, well, water, carbon dioxide, and carbon monoxide draw snow lines that drift as a young star brightens and dims. Bodies formed on different sides of those moving borders inherit different stores. Later, near another sun, the order in which gases wake, water, early or late, carbon monoxide insistent or shy, reads like weather from a childhood lived under shifting isotherms. None of this fixes a coordinate. It sketches a climate, deeper winter or shallower, pores more open or more sealed, layers thin or thick beneath a crust that remembers afternoon and refuses morning. He sets metallicity at the table, a star's overall seasoning of heavy elements. A richer pantry aids dust production, feeding silicates and irons. A leaner pantry inclines chemistry toward different architectures, sometimes toward carbon-rich grains where oxygen runs scarce. If a visitor's dust leaned dark with carbon and shy of familiar silicate signatures, one might imagine a natal cloud whose carbon-to-oxygen ratio favored carbides and graphite over olivines and feldspars. If, instead, the dust sang the well-known 10-micron hymn of crystalline silicate, a more oxygen-generous pantry might be inferred. Not certainty, only a direction of thought, the way a scent suggests a kitchen without revealing the recipe. Isotopes. Draw contour lines across this map. Oxygen's trio of masses tilts under self-shielding in cold clouds. Nitrogen wanders with environment. Carbon hews close to the galactic average. Deuterium rises in waters raised in deep chill. If heard, such tilts whisper of illumination and shade, of gas dense enough to shelter common isotopes from light while rarer ones felt it longer. Heavy water points toward colder neighborhoods. Oxygen's pattern hints at how those neighborhoods were lit. Nitrogen's mood hints at how long winter lasted. Each contour alone is modest. Together, they sketch relief, hills and hollows of history traced in a handful of ratios. Beneath these local climates lies a larger geography, metals richer toward the center, sparser outward, clusters forming and dissolving, stars drifting, for hundreds of millions of years. Tracing one traveler backward through such motion is like following a single leaf on a lake while winds keep changing. Trajectories forget themselves. Composition, however, keeps a kind of inertia. A grain that learned its habits near metal-rich arms may carry an alphabet slightly different from one condensed in leaner regions. The letter forms are subtle, but they persist when position cannot, giving the reader a way to feel origin as temperament rather than as address. Texture holds its own coordinates. Fluffy aggregates scatter light with polarization that deepens and then relaxes at angles particular to porosity. Compact beads speak with a tighter luster. A coma preferring aggregates may reflect assembly by gentle sticking in shaded frost. Compact grains may hint at sintering or partial melting in warm eddies nearer a star. The map here is tactile more than visual, a record of touch in the labors of a disk. Soft collisions, rolling contacts, tiny welds. Even after long wandering, some of that tactility remains, like a fingerprint that survives a rain. He considers short-lived radionuclides, aluminum-26, and its kin, ghost clocks that warmed early worlds before decaying into stable daughters. In the oldest solar inclusions, those daughters remain as after-images, a stopwatch started by nearby generosity. A visitor from elsewhere could, in principle, carry different after-images in grains untouched since birth, revealing whether it's Nursery lived near massive stars or inside a quieter fold of cloud. Telescopes cannot taste such ages in flight. Laboratories would be required. The thought stands without insistence, a reminder that some maps can be read only by touch. Long after the traveler has passed. Every map misleads when time redraws borders. Interstellar passage anneals glass, turns rough into smooth, softens differences the cartographer hopes to keep. Perihelion bakes, radiation gardens, collisions blend families gathered from different shelves. A mineral ratio can be retuned after birth. A crystalline fraction can rise without an inner disk childhood. The ethic, then, favors gradients over labels. Warmer to colder, mixed to segregated, metal-rich to metal-poor, calm to turbulent, so that meaning becomes posture rather than claim. The map is most honest when it remains a mood board, not a passport. Atlases on Earth help teach this reading. In meteorites, presolar grains nest beside nebular condensates. Aqueous alteration sketches brief inland seas on parent bodies. Shock veins mark episodes of sudden force. Each page instructs. Let a mineral ratio be a hint. Let an isotopic tilt be a contour. Let disagreement between lines be a weather front rather than a mistake. With that training, the traveler's dust grows legible in the gentlest way. Whatever its cradle, it belongs to a family of climates matter understands. Furnaces and shadows, winters and transports, thresholds crossed and thresholds refused. Outbound, the maps disperse. The coma thins, small cartouches of chemistry relax into general dark. Yet the idea abides. Matter carries its climates within it, and a handful of mineralogies and isotopes can sketch a path through time even when space refuses a coordinate. The traveler does not care whether it is mapped. The map exists for the listener, who rests easier knowing that even the smallest grains hold geography, and that geography can be read without hurry, the way a shoreline is read at dusk, its contours softened, its meaning taken as weather rather than decree. After the passing, brightness loosens its hold and withdraws like tide from flat sand. The traveler recedes into the broader dark, and what remains stands quietly where it always stood. Instruments cooling into their idle breaths, archives opening their shelves, a vocabulary polished by use. The sky keeps its distances. The room keeps its hush. The narrator observes that what stays behind gathers no drama. It is a modest inventory, an afterglow divided into pieces small enough to carry without effort. First, there is the record. Lines and images, timestamps and temperatures, pointing logs and calibration files sit in calm arrangement. Each frame keeps its metadata like a margin note. When, how long, with which slit, at which angle, under what phase, at what distance, with what uncertainty. Flat fields and darks, those quiet judges of instrument behavior, accompany the science. Frames like guardians. Pipelines remember their steps and their versions, their corrections for optical breathing, their treatment of cosmic scratches. The record does not swell. It steadies. It becomes the kind of memory that future nights respect. Second, there is a small change in the instruments themselves, a refinement of posture. After weeks of repeated looking, a tolerance tightens by a breath. A thermal trend is better understood. A microshutter preference is given a softer correction. A pointing strategy learns to favor a slightly different role. Nothing here announces itself to the world. Yet the next comet, the next interstellar passerby, will meet tools slightly kinder, a listening room tuned a fraction closer to silence. The traveler's retreat leaves this: a better ear. Third, there is language. Words once technical take on warmth. Hyperbola becomes not only a conic but a tone, an art of leaving recorded as curve. Perihelion learns to sit in sentences like a hinge made of light. Coma becomes breath made visible. Phase angle becomes mood. Polarization becomes the way dust confesses texture without names. Ratios keep their honest monotone, but around them grow metaphors that do no violence to their meaning. In classrooms, in observatories, in living rooms, where screens dim to save power, the words move with less stiffness. They lean, they yield, they wonder. Fourth, there is the habit. People who watched now find their nights rearranged, not by obligation, but by preference. A window is checked more often. A weather report earns more courtesy. A star map reappears on a table. In some places, children draw tails on paper moons that do not have them. In others, an old pair of binoculars is cleaned of dust. The traveler teaches a posture of attention that outlives its visibility. That posture is not anxious, it has no fear of missing. It is patient, like someone accustomed to tide tables who knows that water returns without being called. Fifth, there are the small quarrels that are not quarrels. A line that fell on the edge of detection continues to invite careful skepticism. A bump in a continuum continues to ask whether dust alone can sing that way. A period teased from a light curve continues to refine by thirds of a minute as models improve. Preprints sit on servers and grow into papers. Seminars repeat certain graphs and gently amend others. Posters carry sequences of images that need no caption beyond time and distance. None of this becomes doctrine. It becomes companionship. Between question and data, a companionship that is itself an artifact of the passing. Sixth, there is a soft revision of thresholds. What once looked anomalous in a spectrum now looks familiar, or at least plausible. What once looked too faint to be worth pursuing now looks within reach if exposure doubles and patience triples. Upper limits, those generous non-detections, shuffle their digits and lean slightly lower, closing a door on certain extravagant possibilities and leaving open a more interesting meadow of maybes. In this way, absence contributes as presence does. The traveler gives shape to what is not. Seventh, there are images pinned to boards and saved as quiet wallpapers. The teardrop coma, the first suggestion of tail, the soft growth near sunshine, the outbound thinning. Some hang in observatories. Some live on the cool glass in a room where someone reads before sleep. They do not prove, they remind. Over days and weeks, the images keep their power to re-slow breathing, the way a remembered shoreline holds the sound of water even in a city without waves. Eighth, there are models, those unassuming theaters where forces audition. Dust dynamics rehearses synchrones and syndines until the tails lace matches a night that has already ended. Gas expansion rehearses temperatures and collision rates until lines refuse to disagree. Torque models try on jets until the nucleus's period. Changes match the graph that made someone smile. Models do not claim authorship over reality. They practice hospitality, a willingness to seat new data at the table without asking for credentials, to alter the seating plan when a quieter guest changes the mood. Ninth, there is the widened baseline of possibility. The mind has now lived, with a second or third interstellar guest, a reminder that the galaxy's traffic is not merely hypothetical, or if it is the first for someone's lifetime of attention, it becomes an initiation, a gate that opens onto a feeling. Elsewhere is not far, it simply drifts. Future proposals begin to phrase their requests with this in mind. Longer watches at certain geometries, more generous options for phase angles, contingency plans that let an instrument turn on short notice without neglecting other obligations. Scheduling learns to flex, not out of urgency but out of respect. 10th, there is the quiet truth of not knowing. Origin remains a climate, not a coordinate. Isotopes hum their low, patient song and refuse to sharpen into an address. Dust keeps its texture without confessing its house. The coma tells of thresholds and temperatures, but not of the nursery's street. This not knowing is not a sting. It is balm. It tempers the urge to cease with the practice of attending, and that practice, once learned, applies to other matters. Then comets, to weather, to language, to time. 11th, there is a reevaluation of scale. A long, thin line of dust stretching millions of kilometers is recognized for what it is. Minutes of warming made legible as distance. A faint bump in a spectrum is recognized for what it is. Countless identical molecules exhaling together. A small non-gravitational acceleration is recognized as grammar written by jets that would not blow out a candle. The mind grows precise without becoming severe. It learns that the world is built of small effects extended through time. 12th, there is gratitude. Gratitude to instruments that kept their cool, to engineers whose names remain footnotes. 2. Schedulers who carved windows out of crowded skies, to analysts who answered anomalies with patience, to older telescopes that turned again with their old steadiness, and to newer ones that drank faintness and returned it as lines. The gratitude carries no ceremony. It is simply present, like oxygen at sea level. 13th, there is the listener's own archive. A night field crossed, a hill climbed, a neighbor's porch light briefly tolerated, a glass of water lifted. While a camera's timer ran, a quiet disappointment when cloud returns, a gentle contentment when a clear patch opens and the thin tail shows. These impressions are small and irreproducible. They nevertheless count. They teach that looking is an act of belonging, not of conquest. The traveler arrives and leaves. The belonging remains. 14th, there is the revised silence. Not emptier, but kinder. After the tail dissolves, the sky above the horizon looks larger by a shade, as if a door has been found where a wall was supposed. The Milky Way resumes its soft river. The planets continue their bright conversations. The faint zodiacal light keeps its subtle slope from horizon to zenith. The absence of the visitor reads as space made available for the next attention. Nothing leans. Nothing crowds. 15th, there is the open file, a proposal draft saved with a working title, a notebook with a page that begins with a date and a promise to return, a code repository with issues labeled Future Visit, Possible, Isotopes, Dust Color Slope at High Phase Angle. These are modest totems of continuation. They say what science always says when it speaks with its kindest voice. Later is allowed. Finally, there is the way sleep now approaches. The mind has learned a cadence from the traveler, a slow inhale as the comet brightened, a long exhale as it faded. That cadence remains. It becomes a way to leave one day and enter another without strain, to accept that arrivals and departures can be luminous without being loud. The traveler is gone. The practice stays. The room grows darker by a degree and kinder by two. After the passing, what remains is not proof or conclusion. It is an ethic, a set of soft skills, to measure without gripping, to imagine without insisting, to let questions stand like lanterns that do not demand a path, only provide a glow. Silence broadens like a field after harvest, stubble gold under a sky that refuses urgency. The traveler shrinks to a fine arithmetic, a few coordinates that no longer require nightly updates. Instruments breathe at their baselines. Servers hum with the low devotion of storage. The long, kind silence arrives not as emptiness, but as room. Room for the mind to stand back from the bright particulars and feel the contour of what has unfolded. In that contour, questions remain upright, unafraid of their unfinished edges. He notices how silence is not the absence of story. It is the medium that allows stories to hold their shapes without pressing on one another. The hyperbola keeps its quiet arc inside it. The tail, now mostly dispersed into the general brightness, that ever so slightly softens night, keeps its brief grammar of loss within it. Ratios, preserved as numbers in tables, continue to suggest climates of birth rather than addresses. Maps of dust and gas, of mineral habit and isotopic accent continue to stretch like faint cartouches in an atlas a listener can open at leisure. The silence does not argue for conclusion. It offers a chair where uncertainty can rest. There is a feeling that things have become larger, though nothing measurable has grown. The starfield looks a shade more spacious. The familiar constellations feel like a window newly cleaned. Perhaps the enlargement is inward. The attention that once narrowed to a tail length or a line strength now returns to a gentle wide angle, carrying what it has learned about small effects extended through time. The patience practiced in calibration returns as patience toward thought itself. The listener's breath arranges itself to the longer phrasing the sky prefers. He allows the night to populate itself with the quiet signatures of endurance. The zodiacal light keeps its soft slope from horizon to zenith. A planet's steady brightness rehearses gravitational faithfulness. The Milky Way folds into unfussy layers, a river seen from a ridge. Somewhere, Jupiter turns with the unembarrassed dignity of mass. Elsewhere, Mars rises on its thin blue mornings and lets its orbiters sleep or wake according to their chores. None of these sources of light, none of these patterns of motion, require the visitor to remain in the scene. The visitor has done a simpler thing. It has reminded attention that everything here behaves in ways that reward returning. In the long, kind silence, even the earlier possibilities, the shy anomalies that once asked for another look, settle into their rightful scale. Some remain interesting like stones that keep catching the eye along a path. Some have already dissolved into tool marks or into dust, doing a better impression of gas than expected. Some sit in an inbox labeled "someday," an honest word, neither a cage nor a dismissal. Between them drifts the understanding that the threshold between nature and craft is a meadow without fences, and that the honor due to either side begins with careful walking. He lets the planet's older library lean back into view. Oceans continue their slow choreography of settling and dissolving, recording climate with carbonate syllables and clay sentences. Continents continue their quiet. Drift, faults do their conversational grinding. Mountains lean into weather. The idea of a vanished chapter, if it ever can be recovered at all, will be recovered not with trumpets, but with tilts and aftertastes. This recognition no longer pinches. It feels proportional. Even here, silence acts as host, inviting possible. Readings without hard-seating charts. The sea does not rush. Plates do not hurry. The archive turns pages by pressure and time. Elsewhere, in distances the mind cannot hold at once, other disks condense around other suns, their frost lines moving like pale borders across years, their grains colliding, sticking, and, sometimes, remembering to be fragile, their nascent comets filling pantries with winter. The visitor we have just watched becomes an ambassador in retrospect, a small proof that exchange between neighborhoods happens without negotiation. Matter travels gently. It does not require a reason to be welcomed. Silence stands between systems as an avenue rather than a wall. The instruments, too, keep silence properly. They do not spend their rest like debt. They store it like attention, for the next asking. Old mirrors hold their alignment. New spectrographs consider what lines might be heard if geometry is kind. Engineers imagine shutters opening onto future faintness. Schedulers imagine orbits that can accommodate a sudden guest without leaving other work unattended. Planning becomes a form of listening forward. The quiet between visits is not idle. It is ripening. He attends to the ethics the silence has taught. Measure without gripping. Imagine without insisting. Let claims walk when they must, and keep the door open for them to return in different shoes. Consider possibility as hospitality, not as conquest. These soft rules sound like manners, yet they are also methods. A spectrum read with courtesy yields more than a spectrum pressed for confession. A light curve allowed to be ambiguous often shelters the truth more faithfully than one sharpened with haste. The comet has been a teacher in this school that prefers patience to brilliance. The room where the listening happens becomes part of the practice. A chair knows the weight of a quiet body, a window knows where dawn arrives, a notebook learns, a handwriting that grows slower across weeks of attention. The long, kind silence renovates the room without moving a thing. It gives it the atmosphere of a hermitage without the trappings. Screens dim. The small red blink of a recorder keeps its vigil. Even appliances adopt the cadence, cycling with a restraint that suits the hour. Domestic life and sky life, for a time, feel proportionate. He lets memory float in the shallows of sleep like driftwood that has come to rest. The first sighting, small, barely there, becomes a tinier light inside a larger dark. The colors slope. That seemed to redden with distance turns to a faint taste remembered more than a hue seen. The spectrum that hummed with ordinary molecules fades into a low chord one can hum without knowing why. The tale's slow spread becomes a metaphor that avoids claiming itself as such, leaving as luminous patience. None of this asks to be held tightly. The long, kind silence keeps opening the hand. If a listener steps outside, the air accepts them with the same neutrality it offers to trees and roofs. The sky overhead does not recall their name. It does not need to. Yet, in the mind, there is a sense of acquaintance. A hyperbola once crossed this private ceiling. Somewhere out there, at a distance now too wide to rehearse, the traveler continues to inhabit the interstellar climate from which it once came, carrying its stowed ratios and mineral alphabets without pride. To know, that is to find kinship in unknowing. The silence does not shrink, it includes. He thinks of the word after. After is ordinarily the land of summary. Tonight, after has no summary to give. It offers instead continuity. The galaxy keeps its gentle exports and imports. The sun keeps breathing its wind into the local medium. The earth keeps radiating its stored day into the sky. The visitor is already a memory that repetition has made less volatile. What follows is not conclusion. What follows is more sky. The long, kind silence keeps the lanterns lit. Questions set at comfortable intervals along the path that is not a path. One about isotopes, climates of birth rather than addresses. One about dust, texture as an ethics of fragility. One about maps, atlases that prefer moods to borders. One about techno-signatures, possibilities seated politely at the edge of the table. One about Earth, an archive that renews itself by translating. Their light does not compel, it permits. The body feels the permission as ease. A small breeze moves a curtain. Somewhere, a clock keeps time softer than the one that pages were written in earlier. The long, kind silence is not fragile. It can carry the sound of traffic, the settling of a house, a dog repositioning itself, the brief chime of a phone refusing attention. It accepts these ornaments and remains itself. It is the climate in which sleep approaches without being summoned, the climate in which curiosity does not need to raise its voice to be heard. The traveler is elsewhere, the room is here. Between them, a durable hush that does not separate but unites. He allows one last image to take and keep the wall. Interstellar space like a slow river running under starlight, a small object crossing that current without wake, grains in its draft scattering faint brightness that we mistake for message when it is only patience being visible. The mind answers not with certainty but with a sigh that feels like the answer's kinder cousin. The night deepens by a shade. The window holds the sky without gripping. The long, kind silence continues, and in that continuity the listener has all that is needed. Room to rest, room to wonder, and the understanding that unknowing, when treated gently, becomes a cradle. Night settles the way snow settles on a field that remembers wind but no longer feels it. The room rests in its own small gravity. Screens dim, a page closes without sound. The air accepts the weight of quiet breath. The sky holds its deep, indifferent patience at the window, a slow river of light that does not ask to be named. The listener's body learns the cadence again. Longer inhale, longer exhale, as if tide discovers a shore and decides to stay there. A thin draft moves a curtain and stops, like a thought that chooses not to continue. Shadows lengthen into a single. Shade. Far above, stars maintain their comfortable distances, friendly without approaching, exact without insisting. Planets keep their soft appointments. Somewhere, very far off, a small traveler continues in darkness that does not need witnesses, carrying its private weather the way a stone carries coolness. None of it demands attention. All of it permits rest. The room understands. Corners blur. The clock forgets its second hand. A glass of water on a table inherits the stillness of a lake. The listener's weight becomes the room's center, then loosens, then floats just enough to feel lighter than before. Breathing arranges the furniture of thought into wider spaces. Windows hold a piece of sky like a bowl holds water. Steady, reflective, unhurried. Silence earns its own brightness. It spreads across walls and floor without claiming territory, the way dawn spreads before color, the way dusk lingers after. Color leaves. The quiet contains an ocean, and the ocean contains a sky, and the sky contains more quiet. Sleep approaches with the softness of a cloud drifting across a mountain that does not move. No endings ask to be spoken. There is only the drift, the wide, kind drift, where questions keep their small lanterns lit and do not require a path between them. Breath continues. Night deepens by a shade. The window holds. The body yields. The mind loosens its hands and lets the river of dark carry it. End of script. Sleep well.